Sorry, at the moment I cannot see my screen as I'm on present mode. So if anybody has any comments, then please say them. But thanks very much for joining in the morning for this workshop, which seems to be like a subject which is going to get more and more attention as we go along. As some of you know, Climate Trends is a communications agency. We try and do several things. One of them is engaging with journalists, reporters, editors, and the media fraternity in general to try and discuss what the emerging narratives on climate and energy are, and to that extent, what is a good way to report on these subjects, write about them in a way that you can not just create impactful stories, but you're also able to link the dots to what's happening in the policy space and what's happening in your local regions. I must also say that we will try and keep this workshop bilingual. So, and I should preface it that maybe some of the speakers, including me, are used to talking about some subjects more in English, and we might sway towards that. But ultimately, आप सवाल पूछ सकते हैं हिंदी में. We will try and discuss a few things in a way that this is relevant to everybody. Sorry. Well, we try to keep it really simple and straightforward. Those of you who are participating in these sessions for the first time, I'd only say that we have at least tried to bring together some of the best minds who are working on transition, essentially energy transition. अगर कल को कोयला पावर प्लांट या कोल माइंस फ्यूचर में बंद होती हैं 2 या 3 दशक में भी, तो इसका क्या इम्पैक्ट होगा लेबर पे, लोकल कम्युनिटी पे, और really as well on the economy of the town and the state as well. Today, we are going to focus on Jharkhand, as you all know, a state with 40% of India's natural reserves, roughly half the coal mines. And very interestingly, आज से 2-3 हफ्ते पहले जब हम झारखंड गए, and maybe I should have known this before, एक ही रेलवे स्टेशन वहां पर है, which gives the maximum revenue to Indian Railways from across the country, which was quite surprising for me, should not have been, because one would expect कि दिल्ली या बॉम्बे जैसा कोई स्टेशन होगा जो इंडियन रेलवेज को रेवेन्यू देता होगा, but in the end it's one station next to a big coal block which just, and that also shows how the issues of coal transport are so important for the railway sector, and how there are many interdependencies when we are talking about how the transition will look like. Therefore, to discuss all of this today, like I said, we have some of the best researchers who have worked on it. Swati is here, was at the National Foundation and did the report, which a lot of you also wrote about. Many congratulations, Swati, on the new role with the International Energy Agency. We also have Shrestha, who's the director at iForest and has worked a lot on just transition, including a report that they did in the Ramgarh region. In the session, and we have Sandeep, of course, who's joining us in a while from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and has worked a lot on total just transition and what the implications are for labor and the communities. After the lunch break, we have mostly 2 sessions which are focused on how to write about these issues. Mayank from Mango Bay will cover one, and Manjari, who's my colleague at Climate Trends, will mostly cover on how to do better on social media, how to make sure that your posts on social media are read by people. There is a better impact. And between both, we will have Rakesh Ji, who is the head of the research division on at Legal Initiative for Forest and Environment, who has been working on the state for the longest time, not just understand the issues on decommissioning of power plants, but also understand the landscape, the forest areas, and Rakesh Ji will be able to add value to how we will discuss this, not just in the context of power sector and electricity sector, but also in the context of both the political economy, forest conservation, and in that spirit. I just wanted to take 10 minutes to talk a little bit about what we see, especially as a climate unit, in terms of what the discussions are in media and how to bring them together. I think the first point is quite explanatory that at least पिछले 2-3 सालों में एक चीज और ज्यादा से ज्यादा सामने आई है कि डाइवर्सिफिकेशन डेफिनेटली होगा अगले 2 या 3 दशक में। अभी तक जो 60 to 70% हमारी इलेक्ट्रिसिटी सिर्फ कोयला पावर प्लांट से आ रही है, आने वाले कई सालों में वो ऑलरेडी बदलने वाला है और इन अ वे बदल रहा है। द ट्रांजिशन इज अंडर वे बिकॉज अगर आप प्राइसेस देखें सोलर के ऑक्शन के, विंड एनर्जी सेक्टर के, तो प्राइसेस इतने ज्यादा कम आए हैं 70 to 80% इन द लास्ट 4 to 5 years ऑलरेडी। तो होगा क्या, experts the way they say is that renewable energy is going to become the energy of choice। सिर्फ इसीलिए रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी नहीं लगेगा कि हर स्टेट का एक रिन्यूएबल परचेज ऑब्लिगेशन है और आपको उतना लगाना है, बट शायद इसीलिए लगेगा कि उसके इम्पेरेटिव्स जो है वो मार्केट ड्रिवन है। इन्वेस्टर रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी में ही डालेंगे। जो हमने पिछले साल के सभी प्रोजेक्ट फाइनेंस की एक रिपोर्ट का एनालिसिस निकाला लास्ट वीक, तो उसमें ये था कि जितना भी एनर्जी प्रोजेक्ट में फाइनेंस आया उसमें only one coal power plant in Bihar got new finance from Power Finance Corporation. 75% of the money that went for energy finance mostly went to renewable projects. So definitely markets are going to play an important role. जहाँ पे investors का पैसा लगेगा वही चीज में future होगा. But इसके कुछ reasons are overall, and which is what is important to discuss in a workshop like this. बहुत से इंटरनेशनल डिस्कशन, सम ऑफ यू हैव फॉलोड द कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टीज जिसको कहते हैं यूएन फ्रेमवर्क कन्वेंशन ऑफ क्लाइमेट चेंज, जिसके अंदर कोल की डिस्कशन इस बार पहली बार एक डिसीजन टेक्स्ट में आई। तो उससे हुआ ये कि नेशनल लेवल पे जितनी डिस्कशन है कोल एक्सपेंशन की नाउ इज एट दिस पॉइंट अंडर कंसिडरेशन बाय मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ पावर कि आने वाले 5 या 10 सालों में और कोयला पावर प्लांट लगाए जाए या सिर्फ जो हैं उन्हीं को मैक्सिमाइज करके और जो भी एडिशनल पावर आए वो सोलर या विंड जैसे तरीकों से ली जाए या इवन बायोमास। I have written this line which mostly says that India has committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2070. This becomes quite an important play internationally, जहाँ पे ये पूरा साल एक इस तरह का एक मोमेंटम चला कि हर कंट्री को अपना नेट जीरो टारगेट डिक्लेयर करना है, जिसका सिंपली ये है कि लॉन्ग टर्म व्यू में आज से लेके 50 साल के बाद इंडिया के एमिशन, कार्बन एमिशन न्यूट्रलाइज हो जाएंगे नेट जीरो, which means that जितना ऐड होगा उतना ही emissions remove होगा, so net it will be zero. This has many implications. Our speakers will go into it in detail, but I will only say कि जिस तरह से climate एक इतना important geopolitical मुद्दा बन चुका है, उससे ये जरूरी है कि जो भी state level पे policies energy mix की डिस्कस करी जाएं उसमें एक ये overarching theme रहे कि अगर प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने वर्ल्ड लीडर समिट में नेट जीरो कमिट किया है तो उसके implications क्या हैं. I see that Sandeep has now joined and actually is joining. I'll go on, but we'll bring Sandeep after I've ended. And similarly, just yesterday there has been a very interesting news item which says that अक्टूबर में ऑलरेडी कॉप से सिर्फ थोड़ा ही पहले एक एक्सपर्ट कमेटी ने मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ पावर को रिकमेंडेशंस दिए हैं which actually has the phrase which says consideration of not adding further coal plants. Whether this will go through or not, I think the fact that Ministry of Power is discussing all of these things shows that a lot of this is going to come real in the next couple of years. And then the question essentially is that if thermal power plants will not be added, what will happen to coal mine expansion? What will happen to coal dependent states like Jharkhand? Should this happen in a planned manner, or should the transition itself also be should it happen just by the way and bringing the disadvantages or the demerits of the system that we already have? Definitely the second idea is not a choice that we want to make, and therefore this conversation is mostly about what we can do in terms of making sure that the narrative is right. ये सिर्फ मैंने इसीलिए डाला क्योंकि कॉप से पहले, जैसे कि मैंने बोला, काफी डिस्कशन थे कि इंडिया को ग्लोबल स्टेज पे एक नेट जीरो कमिटमेंट देना चाहिए. तो इंडिया ने भी एक पॉलिटिकल master stroke bana ke, so to speak. Our prime minister stood at the beginning of the COP and did announce a net zero goal. What you see on top is actually towards the end of October, net zero se sirf ek hi hafta pehle, where the environment ministry said India is not ready to commit to net zero. Fir second news item dekhiye is from the 2nd of November, which said India pledges new climate crisis goals. और 2 हफ्ते में जब तक COP हुआ तो इंडिया ने कॉप में नेट जीरो कमिट किया. कॉप के क्लाइमेट कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टीज के अपने काफी डिप्लोमेटिक जियोपॉलिटिकल इश्यूज रहे इस कॉप में कि किस तरह से मल्टीलैटरलिज्म को भी सेव किया जाए और कुछ ऐसा दिखाया जाए कि एक्शन हो. करते करते एंड में, फॉर लैक ऑफ एक्शन, आई थिंक द होल इशू जस्ट गॉट बॉइल्ड डाउन into discussing what phase down and phase out of coal really means. जो भी कॉप गीक्स हैं वो इसमें काफी अब्सॉर्ब रहे, एंड मे बी आई शुड नॉट गेट इनटू द डिटेल्स, बट जिस तरह से कॉप एंड हुआ और इतना ज्यादा फोकस रहा सिर्फ 4 कंट्रीज के आपस में डिस्कशन का, इंडिया, यूएस, EU and China, it's very clear that India will stay in the game for how the energy transition in the world will shape. And I'm sure Swati, Shrestha and Sandeep will have more relevant graphs to share. But I also put this slide to say how energy discussions are no longer just rooted in local conversations or regional conversations. They are pretty much rooted in national policy level discussions. They are based in how PMO is thinking about these things, and they are also based in how internationally the world sees India in terms of its energy mix, climate targets, sustainability goals. Our colleague Manjari did this analysis कि मीडिया में किस तरह से इस चीज को पकड़ा गया. तो आप देखिए कि जब भी प्रधानमंत्री ने अनाउंस किया तो वो पीक आई एक, जब मीडिया ने इस इशू के बारे में सबसे ज्यादा लिखा. Actually, this is not transition. This is generally climate change and energy. So definitely, there has been a slight rise, and then of course there is an increase, which also shows कि हमारे यहाँ mostly ये discussion किस तरह से हो रही है अभी भी, कि एक इवेंट को हम कवर कर रहे हैं rather than an issue. I understand also that it's not possible to cover the issue in such a there will be crests and troughs, उसमें उतार चढ़ाव चढ़ते रहेंगे, but ये जो peak थी, maximum engagement happened at a time when India announced the net zero goals, and also globally काफी interest रहा. I have stressed on these things before. बहुत ज़्यादा मैं इसके ऊपर अभी नहीं बोलना चाहती, but I just wanted to show up this slide कि at least from sitting in Delhi, scanning some of the mainline top English newspapers, this is our take on why this conversation is important today. Definitely पिछले 4-5 सालों में इंडिया की एनर्जी के कंजम्पशन पैटर्न्स क्या होंगे, प्रोडक्शन पैटर्न्स क्या होंगे, उसमें चेंज हुआ है. आज से 4-5 साल पहले कोयला पावर प्लांट से चेंज होना ही एक काफी बड़ा मुद्दा माना गया था. नाउ मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ पावर इज टॉकिंग अबाउट इट. तो पूरा जो कहानी है वो कोल हमारा मेन स्टे है से बदल के एक ये हो गई है कि कोल पावर प्लांट को फेस डाउन करना ही पड़ेगा. ज्यादा से ज्यादा इलेक्ट्रिसिटी हमें फ्यूचर में सोलर या विंड से लेनी ही पड़ेगी. हाउ टू मेक श्योर, लाइक आई सेड बिफोर, रिन्यूएबल्स ऑलरेडी चीपर हैं. इंडिया ने बहुत ही बड़े टारगेट को अपने आप को कमिट करा है. आज हमारे पास 100 गीगावाट रिन्यूएबल पावर मुश्किल से है, and we are committing to 450 gigawatts in the next 10 years, especially by 2030 mostly. And this itself is going to be an enormous change in the way that we will look at things. And in all of this, we have large generators like NTPC, which are announcing big plans. We have organizations, we have conglomerates like Reliance, others like Adani, talking a lot about green power. Reliance is starting green hydrogen in Jamnagar. They're going to manufacture solar wafers. We like it or not, a lot of the corporate mindset change on circular economy will mean a lot in terms of how India will consume and produce energy. and that itself, is important. I'm just going back and forth a little bit, but this is also an analysis which shows, especially अगर journalists climate issue के बारे में लिख रहे हैं, तो पिछले 10 या 20 सालों में आप देखिए, definitely there is quite a significant increase in across the main lines, and these are just the 4 analyzed that you can see on screen: Indian Express, HT, TOI, and Hindu. और कितना climate और global warming coverage बढ़ा है, because we as an agency also come from discussing about these issues from an energy point of view, from a climate point of view, which is why I thought, this graph is also interesting to show that this is one way in which the story will definitely be anchored going forward. More and more, we will talk about energy in the context of climate. I will skip through some of these slides because I know that we have better speakers to address what the meaning of just transition is. किस तरह से ये बहुत ही कॉम्प्लेक्स इशू है, बट कहीं ना कहीं इसमें कुछ अपॉर्चुनिटीज हैं और कहीं ना कहीं ये इनएविटेबल है. एंड टू दैट एक्सटेंट, I just pulled out, at least in the last 1.5 months, some of you have already been writing about these issues and really, should be able to speak a lot more at this workshop as well. कि already आप cover कर रहे हैं, जैसे कि there was a nice story in Times of India which actually was saying that if the NTPC power plant in Patratu comes up, then it goes against India's net zero goals. That's the one on top. Then there is the very common sight of how coal is transported loose, where 20-30 sacks of coal on a bicycle mostly, and what it means in terms of the local economy, and several others. The NFI report was covered extensively, not just in English, but also in Hindi, talking about how some of the districts in Jharkhand are going to be quite deeply impacted. And I think so was the Ramgarh study before. Also, this is here, but not for me to explain. I'll let Swati explain more about it. But like I said, in very general terms, just because maximum growth energy sector की India से आएगी आने वाले 1 or 2 decades, 2 दशक में, इसीलिए डेफिनेटली जो फोकस रहेगा ग्लोबल मीडिया का भी, ग्लोबल जियोपॉलिटिक्स का, ग्लोबल क्लाइमेट डिस्कशन का, will definitely pivot towards India on how India is producing and consuming energy. And the more we can break down our conversation at the level of states and the region, the better it will be in terms of the climate targets that we have committed to internationally. Again, some slides which have data and numbers, but I'll let others talk more about the modeling studies which show India's net zero pathways over the next 3 to 4 decades. But all in all, definitely, even in the best case scenarios, the share of coal is going to reduce quite significantly. The question is how, there is a plan for it, how there is a way to show that solar is definitely going to account for more and more and coal for less and less. And that happens in a way that it does not impact communities and livelihoods as much as it would if it is not planned. I don't know if, I think this is my last slide. Yes. And I just wanted to mention a couple of ways, at least in terms of writing more stories journalistically, on what are the opportunities to build a narrative. In the end, this whole phrase, just transition, also, it's been borrowed from the West. In India, it will mean different things. Our current energy regime is not so just, and it feels that it might be too much to ask कि एक नया energy regime आएगा जो नया भी होगा और completely equitable और just भी होगा. I think like for everything else, India will have to find its unique comfort zone around it as well. But at least that comfort zone should include that अगर कोयला पावर प्लांट्स का कंट्रीब्यूशन एनर्जी मिक्स में प्रोग्रेसिवली कम होता है, अगर कोल माइंस इन फ्यूचर क्लोज होंगी, तो अल्टीमेटली एटलीस्ट कम्युनिटीज के लिए और लोगों के लिए नेट पॉजिटिव होना चाहिए. अभी ऑलरेडी इतना डिस्कशन हो रहा है कि कोल माइंस coal power plants को बंद किया जाए, ultimately coal mines impact होंगे. If we are talking of closing coal mines, not just due to climate reasons, if we are talking of closing them even because of their life having been expended and all of that, I think India has a lot of examples जहाँ पे ये ढंग से नहीं हुआ है. बहुत से ऐसे cities होंगे जहाँ coal mines बंद हुए हैं and they have been abandoned and the whole economy of the city has come to a grinding halt. And it will happen repeatedly if it is not planned in the right direction. So social dialogue or partnership का काफी role है. Like I've said a few times now in the last 20 minutes, definitely next few decades may transition inevitable hai. We like it or not, it will happen. And it will happen for all the reasons everybody will talk about today. Roughly, I think India has 2 or 3 decades. The sooner we plan, the better we will be. I just wanted to end here, and I know that there can be a discussion on whether we have a decade or we have 3 decades. Maybe a lot depends on how things will go. To the extent that the last coal mine will still be operational, there can be several and many scenarios to look at it. But the question really is that what are we doing right now, which comes as an opportunity for the enormous amount of change in the energy sector that is going to happen in the next couple of decades. How is it that the state of Jharkhand is well equipped or not to handle? And what are the various mechanisms and opportunities that really exist in terms of making sure that some of this happens in a right way? I only wanted to leave these questions and say that this is what we are going to discuss. I request all of you to, especially the participants and the attendees, to please stay around till the end. We promise to not make it a monologue like I have done. And our other speakers will do a better job. Hi, Sandeep. And at this moment, I will pass on to our first speaker, Sandeep Pai, who, if you have been following the subject, mostly needs no introduction, has researched a lot on the subject on just transition. And right now, the floor will be yours, Sandeep.
Thank you, Aarti, and thank you for that primer on the topic. I'll just go ahead and share my slides. Unfortunately, I'll have to leave after my presentation, after like 30 minutes. So apologies for that, but I'll try to keep my presentation short and then we can have some discussion. So basically, I've been working on this topic for like 4 or 5 years now with my PhD first and now in my job. And so based on that work, I want to give you a flavor of what is just transition in the global context and back that with some recent study we did focusing on Jharkhand. So essentially, it's kind of repeating what Aarti said, that, report after report are saying that in order to meet 1.5 degree target, fossil fuels need to decline rapidly. And there's been so many reports and so many modeling studies that highlight the need to quickly phase out fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. But within this larger technological transition where you switch from fossil fuels to renewables, there are millions of people, communities, regions, in India's case, many districts that are deeply dependent on coal. And of course, acknowledging fully that there are massive, like health and environmental issues locally, we cannot ignore the fact that millions are dependent on these industries. So the question is, what happens to them if this technological transition were to happen? And there's no question that it won't happen. The question is the speed at which it will happen. Now, at a global scale, why people care about this just transition topic? And I did a systematic review, which is reviewing all the literature. And you will see 2 lines of argument, though argument. One is the justice, right? As we move to new sources, we don't want to leave these workers and communities who have actually provided the fuel that, help the country grow. I mean, coal or oil. And so there's, from a justice point of view, it's really important to cater to plan for just transition. This line of sort of argument you will see repeatedly being used by various international organizations, including the Glasgow Pact has language along these lines. The second argument, and this is also a very key argument, and this has really played out in many, many Western countries, is that repeatedly you see pushback from communities who are being left behind in this energy transition. And those fears are being fanned by politicians across, across countries who want the continuation of fossil fuel industries. And I mean, I think Donald Trump is the greatest example of that. But you look at Canada, you look at Australia, there'll be hundreds of examples of politicians playing into this jobs versus climate debate. It's a real policy issue. It's not a theoretical or an academic discussion. Globally, you will see many countries actively working on this topic of just transition. They have created commissions. There are so many policies. There's lots of funding on this topic of how to make sure that workers and communities in this technological transition don't suffer. From Canada to Scotland to South Africa, there's lots of case studies that you can find. Now, so within that global context, I think it's very safe to say that Jharkhand is the most coal-dependent district for various reasons. This is sort of like, this is drawing from one of the recent studies we did. And there are lots of districts which have lots of mines, and I won't get into the district, those details now, but Jharkhand is definitely the most coal-dependent district when you combine various indicators and not just focus on jobs. So one thing, if you want to take one message today from me, I would encourage you to not focus on just jobs. Jobs is one of the many aspects that you have to think about when you think about just transition. So this is kind of we define it as coal ecosystem, right? From national government revenues to district revenues to railway revenues to coal companies spend money on CSR. There are different categories of jobs: direct, indirect, induced, informal. There are 500,000 pensioners. There's various other, various ways of other dependencies. If you see the box 3, from industrial fuel to roads, etc., etc. So I would encourage you to not think about just transition as purely a jobs problem. It's an ecosystem problem. You're trying to replace a large ecosystem, and you have to think about how to replace that ecosystem. So just to give a flavor of what that ecosystem looks like in a state like Jharkhand, and you can find a lot of this information in my dissertation. I have district-wise data for all of this. So about 10 lakh people are directly or indirectly employed in the coal sector in Jharkhand. Now, this does not include from chaiwalas to everybody, coal cycle wala, and all these people. This is directly and indirectly. Almost 1.5 lakh pensioners, almost 7-8% state tax revenues, 800 crore DMF collection, 116 crore CSR spending. So this is just a flavor of the ecosystem. So you can't just think about the jobs when you think about this. And I know that Swati will have more to say about the jobs, so I will not focus much on the jobs here. So all in all, I would encourage to think just transition as a systems coal ecosystem problem, if you think about coal. And there is, of course, need to quantify induced informal jobs and better understand the numbers are not there. My recommendations is that lots of ground reports are needed to really identify and quantify what are the dependency, which goes beyond the visible layers which we see in academic or non-academic studies. But I think journalists are very well equipped to actually show those various levels of dependency which are not easily visible across the coal ecosystem. Now, So that's the problem. That's the problem, right? This is a complex ecosystem. So what do we do about it? So in our recent study, we looked at, apologies for that very, blurry image. I didn't realize that it's so blurry. Anyway, so one of the key things that needs to happen is that a state like Jharkhand needs to diversify, especially zooming in on districts like Dhanbad, and, which are really deeply dependent on coal. They need to really diversify their economy. So this diversification can come from two pillars. One is that the state, sorry, it's written provincial, but I mean state can diversify, state can enable policies with the help of federal government. Maybe climate finance will play a role here. The second is, Coal India and coal companies. I am a firm believer that Coal India and coal companies need to pivot, but they need to pivot in the state, because right now, except some projects, most of the projects in solar and wind that Coal India is planning, it's not planning in states like Jharkhand. It is going to Gujarat and others. So coal companies, if they pivot, they can enable another, a transition to a new ecosystem. And in our study, we looked at various sectors in the state, their potential, what are the drivers and barriers. And you can see that there is lots of drivers. Of course, there are lots of barriers, but there are drivers of economic diversification. It's going to be difficult, but the process needs to start now. Just to echo Aarti's point, whether it is 1 decade or 2 decade or 3 decade, it doesn't matter. If you look at just transition globally, it's a multi-decadal process. It cannot happen overnight. Coal India's first solar or wind project, if everything goes to plan, the first project is going live in 2024. So, but we need hundreds of projects. So you can imagine how much effort is required to actually transition from this current set of ecosystem to the new set of ecosystems. So some insights, Jharkhand can diversify. There is potential. Our study clearly establishes that Coal India is thinking about diversifying, but right now it's not diversifying in the states where it should. I mean, from a business case point of view, it may diversify anywhere, but from a just transition point of view, it's important it diversifies locally where it is operating. So my recommendations going forward, as you dive deep into this topic, it's really, really important to think about regional diversification questions. I think economic diversification is a key pillar of just transition. And then if once just transition becomes an even bigger topic in the future, and governments actually start forming commissions and doing things in the space, you can actually track government and coal company diversification plans and see whether just transition is part of it. I encourage reading South Africa. South Africa is a classic example of what India will do 10 years from today. What the stage of just transition discussion right now in the country is what it was in South Africa in 2008-9. And the way it has evolved and it has become such a central topic in the discussion is something we can learn. And you will find some of that information in the report that I mentioned. The second key pillar of just transition, this is again the second solution, is how do you actually clean up this very dirty infrastructure? I mean, if you go across Jharkhand in any district where there is mines, there's so many abandoned mines, right? Like, how can we use this abandoned mines? How can we backfill to create new industries? And also when you backfill these mines and clean up these sites, you actually create local jobs, you actually create another ecosystem. So it's a really important element of just transition. Again, something that cannot happen in 1 or 2 or 3 years. It will take decades. So we need to focus on that from now. Some insights, there's various regulatory, institutional, and financial challenges to ensuring rehabilitation of coal infrastructure. But rehabilitation must be based on land use policy. So what would be the next, when you fill up these mines, how many jobs you're creating? What is the productive diversification process that you want to do once you fill up the mines? How many jobs can you and you need to consult with local stakeholders. It can't be like, some consultants in Delhi are giving you gyan about how to do all this, but like you have to do it locally. So again, stories, it's for journalists, and I'm giving like these big picture stories. I mean, of course, there's specific story ideas, but you can start to track the environmental rehabilitation process. How is that happening? Whether that is actually incorporating just transition rather than they're just playing a technological sort of transition in that. Then whether local stakeholders are consulted, whether there's land use policies and all that. These are very critical questions for just transition going forward. One more element, I mean, there's many, but these are some examples. So we just did a stakeholder mapping exercise of who are the different stakeholders important for just transition. So you can see the government departments, then there's national groups, like think tanks and academic research institutes. Then there's Coal India. There's unions who are right now not much engaged in this topic. Then there's local sort of non-governmental civil society organizations, and we have identified based on various interviews who are the people who have not engaged or not consulted in the just transition discussion, and you can see those highlighted in yellow. So we believe that there are 5 categories of stakeholders very important to just transition planning. Many are underrepresented because one is that the topic is new, but many stakeholders who are underrepresented do not have the capacity to talk about these topics, engage right now. So it's important to build capacity. So as this topic evolves, journalists on the ground have a great opportunity to provide voice to underrepresented stakeholders. There will be lots of discussion about how to do it, what to do it, who can participate. And so journalists can really play a major role in this. So thank you. This is just, the beginning. Of course, I can take some questions. Some of this, what I just described, is based on our quite detailed case study looking at Pumalanga in South Africa and Jharkhand in India, and we analyzed various elements of just transition. Now, Pumalanga in South Africa is pretty much very similar to Jharkhand in India, being that it's also the most coal-dependent province in South Africa. So there's lots of parallels, lots of learnings. Given the fact that Pumalanga's discussion in just transition is 10, 15 years ahead, it was also interesting to see how Jharkhand's discussion could look like in the future. So I encourage you to just at least scan the report if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep, for the big picture. I think there are 1 or 2 questions which we'll quickly take before handing it over to Shrestha. Yeah. So Rakesh, you had a question.
Yes, Sandeep, that insight you had given for Jharkhand, for the just transition, agriculture and tourism potential, which I don't see that Jharkhand is having too much of potential, because only the 50% of the Jharkhand total land area is a cultivable land, and that is also not irrigated.
Right.
Entire Jharkhand is having the problem of the irrigation problem, mostly the rain-fed. Second, out of 24 districts, 19 are Naxal affected. So how the tourism will pick up there?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So those were in the barriers part. All the points you mentioned were, so the analysis was what are the drivers and what are the barriers. So some of the points that you mentioned are in the barriers. But I mean, look, we are not talking about an overnight thing of diversification, right? You can create some policies, you can enable tourism. I am from Jharkhand, I grew up in Jharkhand, so I know the story from the ground. It is a very challenging place to diversify, but I think the starting point has to be that there is potential. And yeah, of course, there's issues both with agriculture. One thing I would want to point is that I think the idea of thinking about transitioning from coal to one industry is also not correct. We have to think about a cluster of industries, because if you want, like, agriculture could work in one district, let's say tourism could work in other. Like, I'm just throwing an example. And so you got to think about the cluster of industries rather than one.
Are there any one or two quick additional questions? Otherwise, yeah, there are participants who have raised their hands. So.
I see one question from Jaydeep.
Yeah.
A general question from Rajneesh also saying, what's the biggest problem in your view?
Biggest problem right now, I mean, problems will evolve, but right now the biggest problem is the stakeholders are not aware of the topic. So right now, again, this will be very different 3 years from now, but right now nobody knows about this on the ground. So the question of just transition and how to do it well has limitations because unions are not aware about it. Coal India is thinking about it. So various stakeholders haven't really engaged with the topic. So that would be my top problem at this stage.
Would you like to answer Jaydeep's question?
Yeah, Jaydeep, I mean, you're right, to UMPPs. Now, if you're talking about Tilaiya, I'm not sure if it is going to come up. I've been hearing that story from a long time, so not sure if it will ultimately be built. Although, because they had forest clearance issues and various other, I'm not sure if you're talking about Tilaiya, right?
Even the Devghar is, I think, is a shutdown. There was also proposal for the Devghar thermal power plant.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so again, this goes back to the question of whether India will build more coal and whether there is appetite for more coal power plants. And so let's see if these are actually built. I have not seen, I don't know at what stage they are at in terms of like construction. Are they in the advanced stages or in the pre sort of like planning stages? So it will depend on that, I guess.
No clearances has been given to both the projects, whether it is a Tilaiya or Devghar, both. I think the project proponent has withdrawn the proposal or something like that because there is no movement.
I'm not sure. Are there more? Or?
Yeah, there are. I think, Jaydeep ji, if you want to speak, then feel free because you have been filing a lot on the UMPP, and I think which is also your question. But also, Sandeep, if you see in Q&A, there is a question from Rishika, and she's asking if there has been any precedence of how mines have been closed after thorough planning. Is there a best practice?
It's a very good question. I don't know. The answer is thorough planning. I'm not sure, but there are some case studies of good environmental rehabilitation, which has actually been very useful from a just transition point of view. There's one example in Ramgarh where they have backfilled an abandoned mine, and then fisheries were started and local people were employed. There was some examples in Dhanbad of ecological restoration where they did 3-tier plantation and then turned it into some kind of park, and then some people were employed. But I think one of the challenges has been that when mines close, or so far when mines have closed in one area, actually just next to it, a new mine has opened. So I'm not quite sure if the impact has been huge at this stage, because this is all part of the same coal seam, not coal seam, but the same coal field or same coal field. So when you close down one in this part of the district, you just open in the next, like a few kilometers away, another coal mine. And so I'm not sure if there has been such a case where there has been good planning when you close something, but I don't know if the impact is there in case if you open one. Yeah, it's a good question.
There are some hands raised. Sushmita is there, Sumit is there. I know that, we must go to Swati, but since Sandeep, you have to leave right now, maybe we can ask Sumit, Sushmita, Ritin to speak up and ask the question, or would you want to write? Manjri, can you unmute Sushmita?
Am I audible?
Please go ahead. Yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandeep, once again for that very nice presentation. And once again, I got the opportunity to interact with you like this. Um, Very quickly, I had two thoughts. On the question of when we are talking about the question of people being dependent on the coal based economy, I think there's one question that we are not we are yet to look at the qualitative aspect of it, in the sense that pushing for research or journalistic writing which also focuses on sort of people's agencies, how many of those people who are dependent, or what percentage of those people who are actually dependent on this economy are actually by choice sort of involved in those jobs, and are also in the lack of options resort to these jobs, the very nature of precarious nature of these jobs. So this is what something that comes to my mind always when we are being from the state, as you, Sandeep. This is something that comes to my mind. So that was one quick reflection. And the other was I think the issue of land is very big in Jharkhand. Like, I have been following up land issues for quite some time, and specifically in Jharkhand. So there are various, complex phenomena. Like, now we are seeing this land bank, where the common lands are being transferred to these banks without any information, and even the authorities which are maintaining these land banks are quite confused. And even the banks which are supposed to uh, maintain the economic transactions related to these banks are also confused. This is something that one finds when one follows through the local newspapers. So this I think this aspect is also very big when we are talking of just transition kind of research or discussion. And the third point, which is like a broader point, is that how are we defining just transition in India? Because that very debate has also, like, I think, is yet to start properly, as we were discussing earlier in June or something when I was writing my article. So yeah, those were some quick reflections from your
I mean,
presentation.
I think you're spot on. I don't I don't disagree to any of those. Those are all very valid and great points. I think the qualitative nature of these jobs, and whether people are interested in these jobs, or they just do it because there's no other option, is absolute reality in these areas. The land is, of course, both a major issue currently, but also going into the future as we think about diversification options. Yeah, though that would be a major challenging issue, not just in Jharkhand, but also definitely in Jharkhand. But so I completely agree, and I don't think this. Yeah, you nailed it. That's a great point. Thank you.
Is it all right, Shivani, if we move on? Oh, just one last time I'm checking. Sumit, are you unmute and would like to share something? Or we will go on to our next speaker and Mansi, can you unmute Sumit and check?
He has the.
All right. Over to you then, Shivani. And thanks, Sandeep, very much for making it
Thank you.
early or late your time, some different time. Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep. He's left, but if there are any additional questions, please do send them in and we'll try to get them answered. I'll hand over now to Shrestha after Sandeep has given the big picture. I think it might be good to deep dive into what Shrestha has done in Ramgarh, because it's specific. Ramgarh is one of the important districts as far as coal and the sort of coal dependence is concerned within Jharkhand, one of the 5, and there are already mines being closed sort of in a planned and unplanned manner. And I think your study will be useful to reflect again in this group as well.
Thank you, Shivani, and thank you everyone, in fact, of Carbon Reef, Aarti, all of you, because I feel that as we are working more and more on just transition, and we are really working at the state, the district level, jahan transition ho raha hai, there is a need to communicate. And जब संदीप बता रहे थे कि one of the key issues, he might say that there is no awareness on the issue. And by awareness, when we talk of sometime, we talk of awareness of industries, of officials, but we don't really understand what awareness means among communities. And I can't emphasize enough on the role of media and regional media actually, that can play a role in just transition. कि इससे बड़ा role कुछ हो ही नहीं सकता. Because the major issue with just transition is its social acceptance. We can do many research, we can do policies, we can do plans, but unless it becomes a socially accepted fact, just transition cannot happen, very honestly. And I'm just giving you one example of South Africa, where just transition के बाद चल रहा है पिछले 10-11 साल से. But the biggest roadblock आज वो जो hit कर रहे हैं उसका presidential climate commission है. They got $8.5 billion in COP. But the problem today that they are facing is that जो local community है उनसे to get their understanding and their support in some cases. And everywhere in the world, not just in South Africa or हम जो India के बात बता रहे हैं, कहीं भी, without the community buy-in, local लोगों का buy-in, just transition has not been successful. There has been political unrest, there has been shutdowns, there has been huge protest, and that's the reason I feel the role of media becomes extremely important. Now, I will talk of Ramgarh because आज हम झारखंड पे बात कर रहे हैं, but I also would like to specify one thing before I talk of Ramgarh, is that अभी हम छत्तीसगढ़ में काम कर रहे हैं, अभी हम ओडिशा में भी काम कर रहे हैं, and even we have started working in Dhanbad district. And this is what it is too important to understand, that do not make a judgment on just transition just looking at one district or one case. कोल का जो फेस है, it's very varied in India. एक जगह आपको कोयला के साइकिल वाला दिखेगा झारखंड में, coal gatherers and sellers all over the place. But when you go to Chhattisgarh, you will see none of them. It's a very, very mechanized sector, bada mines, which we are working in Korba. Ek district abhi producing 17% of India's coal and employing the minimum number of people. So the entire complexity of the coal economy is much varied across regions, much varied depending on the district's economy, and much varied on who actually is operating there. So I would really say कि हमें, and that's the reason I feel कि Odisha ka media should understand just transition, Chhattisgarh media needs to understand just transition, Jharkhand media needs to understand just transition in the bigger context, but also in the regional context. Now, I'll just share a few things to talk about Ramgarh, which I think is also the big picture of India we need to understand. And that's the reason we need to tie in everything today. सबसे बड़ा सवाल है कि अभी हम सबको पता है कि कॉप अभी अभी खत्म हुआ है, एंड आर्थिक टुडे पॉइंटेड आउट अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग इन अ प्रेजेंटेशन इन द बिगनिंग कि देयर इज अ डिस्कशन अभी चल रहे हैं, एंड दिस एक्सपर्ट कमिटी हैज सबमिटेड देयर proposal to the Ministry of Ministry of Power कि अभी to put a halt on new power plants. Same thing has been, the Coal India has been thinking for a long time कि what to do with their underground mine, क्योंकि इस देश में Coal India का 40% mine underground mine है, and ये 40% underground mine से only 5% of the production comes. Now this is the challenge of coal today कि इतना अंडरग्राउंड माइन है, लगभग 170 अंडरग्राउंड माइन है, उसमें से बस 5% कोयला निकल रहा है कोल इंडिया का प्रोडक्शन का. व्हाट डू दे डू विद दिस माइंस, बिकॉज इट्स अ लायबिलिटी ऑन द कंपनी. आप अगर कोल इंडिया लिमिटेड का अभी का जो एनुअल रिपोर्ट आया था, the recent latest annual report, they have pointed out that running the underground mines is one of the biggest liability for the company. Now here is the question. So when we talk of just transition, abhi upar there is no discussion on it. There is a big question on kaise coal mine close down honge, phase down honge, phase out honge. That entire thing blew up in COP. But the situation is that there are at least 160-70 mines which are underground and which are being considered, usme se bahut mines are being considered as unprofitable by the coal company itself. If you go to Jharkhand, and this is what we tried to do last year, 50% mines in the state at that time were temporarily closed. Abhi bhi wahi hai. Now, temporary closure का मतलब ये होता है कि वो कभी भी खोल भी सकता है, but खोल नहीं भी सकता है. Recently, we were in Jharkhand 2 months back in Dhanbad. There is a mine which has been closed now for the 1.5 years. किसी को पता नहीं है वो माइन कब खुलेगा, नहीं खुलेगा, कुछ भी. So what do we do with this kind of closures? These are called temporary closures. It can turn into permanent closure, and there is a huge amount of uncertainty and job losses around it. Not a formal worker, but informal worker. So when we talk of India's just transition, it looks very different from many parts of the world. कुछ सवाल हमारा भी, उनका भी जो है हमारा भी है, जैसे कि लेबर को क्या करना है, फॉर्मल वर्कर का क्या करना है, इकोनॉमिक डाइवर्सिफिकेशन का क्या करना है. बट हमारे देश के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में देयर आर मेनी इश्यूज व्हिच आर वेरी यूनिक टू अस. नंबर 1 इज व्हाट इज जस्टिस इन इंडिया. Justice is just transition has become a thing like हम पहले I have been जब से मैं पढ़ाई करती थी, we use the term sustainable development became very popular. सब उसको use करते थे. Everyone used to talk of sustainable development, and it became a term कि आप कहीं भी बिठा दो उसको. Today just transition is becoming something like that. But what is justice in the context? And I'm glad someone raised that question. What is justice for India? What is just transition for India? And what we wanted to do, and today it's beyond the scope, we tried to define this in a paper we did is October में, and we submitted to the parliamentary committee also कि India में justice क्या है, India में just transition क्या है. Number 1 is the question of justice is related to poverty and deprivation of our coal mining regions. अब ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा coal mining districts में जाएंगे, there are 40 to 50% of the people who are multidimensionally poor. Niti Aayog recently has come up with their own multidimensional poverty report in 2021, and they have started doing it based on the UNDP and the Oxford research that has been ongoing on this. And it is showing that these districts are really poor, not in just terms of economic terms, but in terms of healthcare, education, basic amenities such as drinking water, electricity access. Isko kehte hain multidimensional poverty. So when we look at the poverty today, when we talk of just transition today, we need to understand कि इसको address करना है, not just giving job substitution. Second thing is India's justice is also related to pollution burden that the poor in these regions have been shouldering for years now. Every coal mining area, media ने इतना report किया है, we all know that this is something that needs to be addressed now. Most coal mining areas in India are critically polluted areas. अभी भी आपका हजारीबाग coal field ले लीजिए, चतरा कोलफील्ड चतरा हजारीबाग कोलफील्ड ले लीजिए, धनबाद, कोरबा, अंगुल तालचेर, सिंगरौली, everywhere it is critically polluted. There is a huge question of displacement which is there, and poor rehabilitation and social exclusion. Of course, when the mines came up, people were not consulted in many cases. Now, when we are talking of phasing down the coal, how we include them? That is the question of justice. The second thing is the nature of the workforce that this country has. And we started off with this with the Ramgarh study last year, looking into in depth kiska complexion kya hai. Our country, coal mining mein formal workforce kam hote ja rahe hai because of mechanization of mining in the last 10-15 years. It's steadily declining across all the PSUs. But what is happening is two things. One is there is a lot of contractual employment, and there is the informal worker. And informal worker क्या है ये आपको कोई भी data से पता नहीं चलेगा. We are working now, I'm saying, in 3 states, and nowhere we have a clear answer on this. We did an in-depth study in Ramgarh. We are releasing our Korba study in January. And we tried to understand who are these informal workers, what are they doing, uska age kya hai, uska skills kya hai, usko tankha kitna milta hai, usko kaise transition mein, what options do they have? And this is something is unique to India. The second thing is these people are highly unorganized. There is no one to speak in for of them. So either the civil society takes up a big role in this, the media has a big role in this, to highlight these people, to talk about them, to talk about their plight, and make sure that people recognize their importance. The third thing in India's context is the economic dependence of some of the coal regions. And I'll show in many of the coal districts, about 30 to 40 to 50% of the GDP is just coming from coal mining. Now, how do we go about talking about this? Basically, the district economy is coal-centric. So, हम जब economic diversification के बात कहेंगे, and Sandeep was telling that there is no one-cut solution, and it is not as simple कि आज जो कोयले पे या power plant में काम करे वो कल जाके खेती कर ले. That is not going to be the option. So we need a diverse economy in these regions. We need to build service sector. The biggest problem we are looking district after district, the weakest point is the service sector currently. But the tomorrow's economy is going to be heavily reliant on service sector. So how do we build this new economy is going to be a big question. The coal dependence on revenue of Ramgarh या Jharkhand या छत्तीसगढ़ आप कहीं भी ले लीजिए, direct revenue from coal mining is actually not that scary. This is the good news in some ways. We all know there is a lot of other taxes that people get based from coal-based industries, but coal mining से सीधा जो direct tax निकलता है, वो इतना बड़ा बात नहीं है for substitution. And when we talk to administrators, they also say, yes, it is a problem because other industries are around coal, but coal mining itself alone is not the biggest revenue substitution question. Therefore, when we talk of just transition in India, and in Ramgarh boliye, ya to Dhanbad boliye, ya to Bokaro boliye, jahan bhi, the question is not just talking of coal mining or coal-based power. It will be taking into account what happens, how do we go about a transition of coal washery, the brick units, the steel plants, the cement units, the sponge iron units, which are operating in these regions. Because there will be a ripple effect. One coal mine closes down, the coal feed of these industries will change. So how do we go about integrating these industries? And this is something we have to start on now, because we can't talk of coal mine for the next 20 years and then start suddenly talking of steel or sponge iron or brick. So simultaneously, when we are looking in any one district also, हमें ये पूरा landscape को थोड़ा समझना है. Coming to Ramgarh, this is one district we studied last year of Jharkhand, which we took for a various reasons. हमने रामगढ़ को लिया था. Number one is that this district, मैं काम कर रही थी ये district में 2017 से, and there has been a steady decline in coal production. It was when I started working, it was मैं DMFT पे काम करती थी तब District Mineral Foundation पे, and its earnings from DMFT was just after Dhanbad and Chatra. When I went back to work in this district in 2020 early, it became the 5th or 6th district, and other districts have taken up. The reason it was that first मैं सोची मेरा data गलत है. Then I went to start looking into the mines, and we found that there are mines which have been slowly closing down in districts. And this was a change that was happening in just 3 to 4 years. The time we were doing the study in Ramgarh, it was producing about 10% of Jharkhand's coal, about 13 to 15 million tons per year. And 50% mines in the district were already closed, and many of them were unprofitable. 2/3 of them, operational mines, also were unprofitable. The thing is that this district is a small district. वहां पे ज्यादा से ज्यादा जमीन कोयले के नीचे आता है. So about 10.5% of the district geographical area was under coal mining. The next question, what was important from Ramgarh, is it showed that there is a high informal and subsistence dependence on coal. And this again, I'll say, this is a case which is very unique to Jharkhand coal regions. The coal gatherers and sellers, जिसको वहाँ cycle वाले कहते हैं. You can see that in Ramgarh, you will see that in Hazaribagh. I don't have to say more about it. Chatra, Dhanbad, ab kahin bhi jaiye. But again, this is not the case in Korba or in case of Angul, Talcher. And that's why I put these two graphs side by side. Ramgarh में आप अगर देखेंगे हमने 400 household survey किए थे. It was actually, and it showed that out of that, about 27% of the households were coal dependent. But उनमें से लगभग 60% household were just coal gatherers and sellers. So there was a huge dependence, not just informal workers, but we call it the informal economy. Because ये informal worker है नहीं, लेकिन इसके indirect dependence है coal पे, ये informal economy के हिस्से है. When we are now looking at Korba, the picture is completely different. There is no coal gatherer and sellers, but there is a huge number of informal workers, which is nearly more than the formal workers. There are pensioners, and there is a number of laborers. ये laborers है almost like, ये हर जगह काम कर लेते हैं, because there is no job in the district other than coal centric job. तो ये कुछ टाइम खेती कर लेते हैं, कुछ टाइम forest dependent livelihood कर लेते हैं, कुछ टाइम construction work कर लेते हैं. They are doing a mix of work, and this constitutes the biggest part of the workers other than agricultural laborers in this district. And this is the worker complexion we have to deal with when we are talking of just transition in any of the coal regions of India. The next question is about, this is what I was talking to you. The coal regions remain highly vulnerable from transition today. If I have mapped some, like Dhanbad dekhiye, Korba dekhiye, Jharsuguda dekhiye, and your top 5 are Jharkhand district, where the share of mining in the district GDP ranges from 40% to 25%, 30% some cases. And if you take mining plus manufacturing, because यहाँ जो industries लगे हुए हैं वो कोयले पे dependent है बहुत सारा, the proportion becomes about 40 to 50% minimum. So 40 to 50% district GDP is coming from coal mining plus coal-based industries. And this is something, when we are talking of a transition, we need to think of. This is the economic diversification we're thinking of. 50% GDP substitute karna hai. And it's not a small thing to deal with. The shocking challenges, and that's the reason we need to really, really highlight the challenges of India's coal today, is India is having ambitious plan on energy. Renewable energy targets are very, very ambitious. 2030 targets has been set in COP26 right now. But the investments that are happening in renewable energy are not where the coal mining states are. So the leaders of coal today, which is your Jharkhand, Odisha, and Chhattisgarh, will not be the leaders tomorrow. The energy map in India will completely be different. And and the problem is that where energy investments are happening, RE energy, these states are not poor states, but Jharkhand, Odisha, Chhattisgarh are poor states. So the poorest part of the country can be poorer in 10-year time if we do not start planning a transition today. and investing in the states and district. So this is where the bigger challenge is. And if we do not do this, it will not just be a regional problem, it can become a countrywide problem. There will be migration, there will be social instability, there will be political instability. Now, this is something when we are talking of just transition, when we're reporting on it, we need to keep in mind. Just transition is not about the question of coal workers, it's a question about the country's political stability in the coming years. So what do we look out on for just transitional communication? And I put some very, very basic points that to look out for. Number one, and particularly today, because we are talking to media, we are talking about reporting, to understand the informal workers and the informal economy. The researchers, the government data, unless we go to do research in the ground, spend a lot of time, we are not being able to capture this. It took me 3 months time to work in Korba, be there. The team went 4 times to capture what is the informal worker and the informal economy like. So media can be actually the biggest resource in this to tell people the complexion of informal workers and the informal economy countrywide, which is varying district to district and state to state. Second thing is to understand the indirect dependence. There is a huge amount of indirect dependence. Trucker hai, mechanic hai, koile raste se jaate hai. There is no estimation of how many truckers and how many transport sector workers are related to coal. How many businesses are dependent on coal? What is their vulnerability from a coal transition? This is something I feel media can report on a big time, help people understand and help enrich the knowledge on just transition. Third thing is what is happening to local development funds. We all are talking about that just transition will take a lot of money, require a lot of money, which is today extremely important. But then there are also local development funds which can start the process and help to build community resilience. शिक्षा पे उसके खर्च कर सकते हैं, local livelihood के लिए पैसे हैं, health care के लिए पैसे हैं, education के लिए पैसे हैं. And I am giving you some of the example. District Mineral Foundation funds. In forested area, there is Campa fund. There is Tribal Sub-Plan fund. There are millions of hundreds of state government schemes. What is happening to these schemes? Can these resources be pulled to support a just transition? Coal cess का क्या कर सकते हैं अगले सालों में? This is all we need to think, and this is something again media can report on. What is happening to these development funds? How can they be used? What are the challenges of using them right now? And this is a learning for just transition, because just transition is not something new that we are going to do. The challenges were there always. Now we are placing it in the context of climate crisis, and we need accelerated action. Finally, another thing to capture is the experiences of closure. India has very little experience of coal mine closure and uska kya hua hai. When we look into the cases of Goa mining, जहाँ Supreme Court के order से mining suddenly close हुआ था, people job loss. There is some study in Odisha जहाँ iron ore mining closing हुआ था. We know the case of Karnataka. There are very few cases of coal mine closure and what happened actually to the local communities. How did they suffer? And this time we captured a case study in Chhattisgarh. We tried to do it in Jharkhand. ज़्यादा कुछ हमें मिला नहीं. But the problem is that experiences will tell us what can happen when an industry closes. And I would say, don't just look on coal mine. Look in any mine. Look at any industry. What happened? The ripple effects of closure are everywhere the same. Coal mining ke liye, there will be some unique challenges. But the effect on the community from an industry closure, some experiences will be very, very same. And capturing this experience will be extremely important to develop just transition policies and local level plans. And with that, I feel with all of these, at least as a starting point, the media can have very, very important role in enriching just transition research, in influencing policies, and more importantly, influencing state and local level action where it can start right now. And with that, I'll stop and I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrestha. Thank you for taking the time. And I see there are questions in the chat. There's Abhijit. Do you want to raise your hand and ask the question? I mean, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? Or if not, his question is about the dependence on underground sort of coal mines.
I can ask the question. Can you hear me?
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah. So what is the total population that is dependent on the 170 underground coal mines, which are producing 5% of the total coal? And what percentage is women out of it?
So Abhijit, the dependence question, as I said, is very complex. Now, if I look at the formal workers of this is currently about 40%, 30% of Coal India's workforce, 30 to 35%. So, for example, if a big open cast mine today is producing 40 million tons of coals, is employing 2,500 people, underground mine producing 0.5 million ton of coals employs about 500 people. So this is the discrepancy. So you are producing 40 million tons of coal per year, employing 2,500 formal employees, whereas you are producing 0.5 million tons of coal per year, employing anywhere between 500 to 1,000 people. And this varies mine to mine. So there is no clear estimation, but this is what it is. I'm telling you from a very district level and mine level understanding, and then you can see how much it is. The second question is that when we talk of how many people are depending on it, here I told very clearly that there is no estimation of the informal workers in India. And here is the challenge. Because from state to state, though the number of informal worker varies, but Jharkhand, it is nearly 2 to 2.5 times the formal workforce. For bigger mines, it can become 1 to 1.5 times of the like almost 1.4, 1.5 times the formal workforce. So if you put the informal and formal workers together, just a ballpark estimation of an underground mine which is producing about 5 million ton of coal, it is employing about 2,000 people. So it is a lot of people who are engaged in this mine with very, very little production. That is the challenge. And the second problem is, you asked about women. India's coal mining sector does not engage women formally because the Mines Act, which was there, Purana, which prevented women from working in mines in various ways, except for some hours of the day. And it was completely prevented for underground mines because of the, the safety reasons. So women were not allowed to work in underground mines. So there is no formal women worker you will find in underground mines. But where women employment comes in is in the informal work. And underground mine mein itna aapko nahi milega. You will find it in open cast mine, where women are the biggest part of being this coal gatherers and sellers. I was talking of Jharkhand. So in Jharkhand, if you walk out in the morning, these women go down the mine shafts or walk up the pahad, the overburden piles are there, to collect the coal from there, bring it home, take out the ash content, and then the male family member puts it in a sack and sells it in the market. This is where the women force is. The women workforce is largely the informal workers in the coal sector.
Okay. So as a follow-up question, if I look at India's history of 75 years, the justice and the transition really hasn't worked successfully, except in Narega, which is basically two people working their entire life for 40 years to get it work. So in a situation where the gun is at the temple, how do you see that we'll be able to transition when we don't even have sense of justice in the society at this point in time? Our minorities are kind of suffering, who don't have poverty or justice situation otherwise. And in general, I think the mindset is very, very at status quo, right? So we don't really raise our voice as a society together. So what is the political and bureaucratic will really behind it?
Yeah, so that is what I was trying to say, and the question about just transition is, and the way justice can only be ensured, is that we have to see the political stake in it. I say just transition is less of a question of anything, it's many things, but the biggest question of just transition is the political economy question, and the politics is the main thing which will drive. Now the only reason what you said is absolutely right, but the reason that just transition justice can be ensured if the people understand that if justice is not ensured, then the region's social stability will go on a sixer. Basically, there will be enormous social unrest. I'm giving you an example why India might, and if India really pays attention to this, they might want to do it. Sandeep is from an organization, today he spoke, and that's why I'm giving the reference, CSIS. Now, those of us who know CSIS in US, CSIS is largely supported by Pentagon. What were the chances of an organization to start working on just transition? The reason many of these people are working on just transition today and working worldwide, and that's the reason it is such a favorite topic, because everyone understands that if it doesn't happen, it will lead to political instability. There will be migration. There will be problems of poverty, which will spill over to me. So today, if I do not stabilize Jharkhand and ensure justice of people in this region, then they will come to Delhi and I will have to bear that burden. Nowhere until now, this amount of crisis has cropped up. We are talking just transition is not about one industry or one sector. Actually, we are looking at a transition which is completely redoing the economic landscape if we are doing just transition. Right. In that sense. Because as I said, Koila, there is coal-based power, there is steel, and Swati will come to this. There is cement, and steel cement is much bigger industries. Look at the Bricklin sector. So if you do not understand or ensure justice, and justice can be defined theoretically or everything in very different ways, but to ensure the basic wages, give them a support before even you start closing down, then not let you close. So if you do not ensure justice, just transition cannot happen in India. No one will be able to close this mining or power plants you can discuss theoretically year after year. Or you have to do a top-down process where there will be political unrest. Now you have only two choices to deal with just transition. And I think that's the reason justice will get heard in the process if we are serious about it.
So Shweta, just have one final question as a follow-up. Do you remember 1970s?
I'm very sorry, Abhijit.
Yeah.
Abhijit, I'm very sorry. But could you reserve your questions for later? Our next speaker is in line as well and has to leave. Yeah. Thanks very much. Over to you, Swati. Rakeshji after Swati, please, if you don't mind.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Aarti. Thanks, Shrestha. Very good presentation. So I'm going to continue from where Sandeep and Shrestha have worked on this, if my screen is visible to everyone. So this is to answer, I've seen some of the questions crop up in the chat box on what is the labor profile and why does it matter? So let me look at it from give you a sense of the formal, informal, and the contract labor perspective and why transitions in India will change. I know a lot of you are journalists and you know this story from the ground level. I was a former journalist as well, so I share a lot of sentiments when I read stories on this subject. But what we've tried to do is we've tried to get evidence on some of these issues. So if you look at this chart on why coal transitions matter in India, this is something that gives you a share of the gross value added by the mining and quarrying sector, but at the same time, the share of the informal worker in the sector. This was in the National Economic Survey that was released last year. A lot of this data is taken from PLFS, which is the Periodic Labor Force Participation data. But I personally think that even with the PLFS, there is a lot of undercounting and conservative estimates that actually end up happening. What is also necessary to understand, and both Sandeep and Shrestha have spoken about this, that when we look at a coal transition, what we are essentially planning for is a transformation of the Indian economy. Why do I say this? Abhi aap hamara labor force का वर्कफोर्स का लिटरेसी देखिए, लिटरेसी अगर आप देखोगे तो 78% है, लेकिन ये 78% से सिर्फ 11% ग्रेजुएट डिग्री या उसके ऊपर है। अगर कंपेयर करेंगे और वो सेक्टर में देखेंगे कि आपको किस तरीके का स्किल सेट चाहिए, किस तरीके का एजुकेशन बैकग्राउंड चाहिए। If you look at what some of the current skill development initiatives that are actually happening, they focus on ITI holders. And who is an ITI holder when we look at coal mining, when we look at coal transport, when we look at every other sector that is linked to the coal ecosystem that Sandeep spoke about? It's only 11% of the workforce, or even less when we come to the sectors. So these are some of the reasons why we need to understand, given automation, given the transition to a cleaner economy, we are going to see a complete reorientation of what the labor force will be. And very roughly, I mean, over the last 2 years, we've seen India needs to add 8 million jobs on a daily or on an annual basis. Without taking into consideration the characteristics of the labor force, the job losses versus job gains will possibly be much higher. So coal in India at a glance is something that I'm going to skip because we all know about this. This is something that the IEA had projected. This was before India announced the targets at Glasgow. So please bear in mind that these scenarios came out in May of 2021. But as you see, the share of coal is still a part of the energy mix, but it goes down as we move forward. Similarly, if you look at the picture on the extreme right, that is how coal production is in the short term. Between China and India, we are literally 2/3 of the coal production and consumption in the global economy. So when we look at just transition, the amount of focus that is on India क्यों है? क्योंकि more than anything, if India and China decide that we will move away from coal, there is going to be transformational impact. Today, the number of people who are employed in the coal value chain and supply chain in India, it has been unprecedented because even UK, at the height of its coal mining in 1920s, was a drop in the bucket when it comes to India and the people dependent on the Indian coal sector. So what we essentially did was we tried to figure how many jobs are linked to the coal sector. And when I talk about the coal sector, I'm looking at coal mining, coal transport, different modes of transport, the power sector, bricks, iron, sponge iron, and the steel sector. Then we try to get an estimate of when we look at Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Orissa, because between these three states, we cover about 80% of the coal that is mined in the country. And then we came to and then we thought to understand what is going to be the socioeconomic profile of the labor. Because when we think of retraining, when we think of reskilling, if we don't want migration, how do you even start attempting to craft some of these policies? This is the coal value chain. This is something that we've done. I'm going to skip, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to the next slide. So very briefly, why Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa are important. 80% of your coal production, 40% of the 1,500 units are in Odisha, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh. From a thermal power plant side, also particularly important. What we did was we tried to understand, if we look at one or more coal assets in all of these districts, which are the districts that are going to be impacted at a national level. So if you look at it, there are 266 districts in all which have one or more assets that are linked to coal production and consumption. But then what we did was we removed the districts which have less than 1 million ton of iron and steel units. And that left us with still 135 districts in all the states, which have two or more assets that are linked to coal. Now, the way I and the stakeholders that we spoke to understood coal transitions was, given the fact that India is going to continue relying on coal, your most vulnerable districts will be districts where mining is uneconomical, which have a larger proportion of underground mines, which are also uneconomical, where Your power plants are, say, more than 25 or 30 years older, where your iron and steel units are less than 1 million ton, which basically means that because of low margins, because of low capacity, they will not be able to transition to cleaner technologies. Cleaner technologies in the iron and steel sector is essentially right now natural gas and then hydrogen. Hydrogen is only useful for plants with 10 million ton plus of capacity, which is barely about 10 units in the country. 10 or 20 units in the country have this kind of capacity. About 1,300 of your 1,500 units are less than 1 million tons. Most of them are in the range of 5 lakh tons per year. Small family run units, so not enough margin, not enough money or knowledge to change to a technology that could be cleaner. Very briefly, 13 million people across the coal value chain. I call this very conservative because the way we've done the bottom-up calculation, we've estimated that everybody is running at very optimal capacity. Okay. To try and get a sense of if everything runs at a very optimal capacity, what is the kind of people that we are looking at. So on the labor mining side, we looked at every mine. We divided that into open cast and underground. We then further subdivided that based on mining techniques at every one of these mines, which then give us a scenario across 3 sectors. On the labor transport side, we essentially bunched up roads, railways, looking at looking at your trucking capacity, and then therefore how many people would be involved. Your labor on sponge iron and the labor in the power sector were also done on a similar basis. As a thumb rule, in the power sector, for example, your share of formal to informal workers is 1:3. In your sponge iron sector, it is 1:2. In the blast furnace side of the operation, it is 1:4. In coal mining, it is 1:4, depending on whether you're looking at underground mine, whether you're looking at open cast mine, what subsidiary you're looking at, because every subsidiary outsources different portions of its supply chain. Transport is mostly outsourced, so we don't have to worry. The road transport is more worrisome than railways, because the share, while 50% or more coal goes by railways, and I think 50% of the railway freight revenue is dependent on coal. If you look at it from an actual worker perspective, it's only about 5% of all the people employed in railways. So that's not something. So railways has to worry from a fiscal point of view, not from an employment or a labor perspective, but every other industry, the worry is from a labor perspective. Here we try to bifurcate into skilled and semi-skilled jobs. The reason for this is a lot of the skilled jobs, which is your graduate and postgraduate jobs, can be easily transferable between different industries. But some skilled and semi-skilled jobs cannot, because a question that I got from the power sector, a welder in a thermal power plant is a highly skilled profession. But where will you place a welder whose education qualification may not merit him a job in some of the more technical, technology intensive sectors in renewable energy? So the way we understand skills has to be separate when we look at coal transitions, because what is nationally understood as skills and what is understood as skills at the sectoral level, and then going beyond the sectoral level at an asset level, is very, very different. Now, the brick sector that Shrishta mentioned, to my mind, is one of the most vulnerable sectors, because most of your people work only 6 months in a year. Brick agriculture is the fallback industry for all the people across all the sectors. Over here, there is no data on where your bricklins are, how many people from which villages go to which bricklins, how many of them are actually, do they go on a year-on-year basis, do they not go on a year-on-year basis? What if 1 year they decide to get work as a Manrega worker rather than go in a bricklin? So this is a very fluid sector, but at the same time, if you look at it from a coal consumption point of view, it is the highest sector that consumes coal. It's about 30 or 40 million tons of this sector that consumes coal. There is technological innovation that's coming. The red bricks that we end up using in the construction industry, that's going down steadily, and it has gone down drastically over the decades, particularly if you look at it from a large urbanization point of view. But that has not lessened the dependency in terms of labor in this sector. So when we look at coal transition, how do we even talk about something like this? Somebody asked about profiles on, what is the number of women. So if you look at PLF's data, they give you some estimates of how many men and women are involved in these sectors. Again, I think they're very conservative numbers, but it's great to have some baseline in terms of what is the proportion of women. So technically, the proportion of women in coal is actually higher than other sectors if we look at it from a coal supply chain perspective, because as Shrestha mentioned, a lot of them are coal gatherers, a lot of them work in the informal economy, but coal is their second or first nature of job. Why are job contracts important? As contractualization of jobs has happened, if we understand labor contracts, most of the people don't have written contracts, in the sense they are hired by contractors who give the data to the Labor Commission, but this data is not in public domain. So when we have to plan for transition policies, we don't even know the kind of people that we are planning these policies for, because most planning when it comes to transition, when it comes to the energy sector in India, happens in a top-down manner. The governance of coal is at the national level. The governance of oil and gas is at the national level. Even renewable energy is at the national level. Your targets are all decided at the national level. It's states that only do implementation. So if even at the national level, if we don't understand who these people are, what is the nature of the job contracts that they have, then it's going to become very difficult to identify how policies should be made or structured in these areas. This is, and like, look at transport, for example, 70% of them are, 92% of them are in the informal sector. But if you look at the nature of contracts, no social security benefits, no pension, no leaves, no formal institutionalization that allows us to direct transition policies. If that is not happening, and if governments are not stepping up to do this, then it's going to be a scenario where the industry will transition, people will eventually migrate, and then we don't know what is actually going to happen to these people. The idea right now needs to be, so this is literally my last slide. So what is going to be the broad takeaway? So it's going to be uneven across sectors and job profiles because of your skills, because of your labor characteristics. It's going to be very difficult to design. So how do you design these policies? Do you design them sector-wise? Because all sectoral roadmaps talk very different in terms of how they see the growth in the sector. Iron and steel, for example, says that we are going to continue using coking coal for our blast furnace operations, which means coal handling will still be a profile that will be needed within this industry. But if you look at it from a net zero perspective, we cannot have sponge iron, which employs most amount of people, within this, because sponge iron uses non-coking coal. So none of your sectoral roadmaps map. Power is probably one of the easiest sector to decommission and to decarbonize, even from a labor perspective, because most of your labor and the labor profile in the power sector can actually be transitioned to a renewable energy sector if we are planning for that within these states. If you're not planning for that, then again, the sector is in a bit of a problem. We need to understand, given all of these characteristics, we need to define who is a coal transition worker in India. Because if without the definition, someone who works in the sector for 6 months in a year, someone who's in the informal economy, someone who is a rickshaw, cycle rickshaw wala, he's not going to get formally employed or even informally employed. We are literally leaving it to chance going forward. Okay, Shrestha and Sandeep have both mentioned this, that we need to have district-specific indicators, district-specific data. Because right now, even if we look at it direct, indirect, and induced jobs, okay, jobs is literally just the tip of the entire pyramid. In the US, when we look at the oil and gas industry, they have district-wise data that allows them to do CG modeling, that gives them a perspective of how many what is the induced dependency of a district on oil and gas. We don't have that in coal. We don't forget in coal, we don't have that in India at a district level to begin with. Okay, so this is something that was one of our recommendations, because NSSO does it. They did it this year for agriculture. So this was one of our recommendations, that this has to happen. What are some of the immediate strategies? And this is something that I think rings true right from Shreshta's research, Sandeep's research, and a lot of other research that is happening in this sector, that we need to start identification process. We need to have an idea कि कि कौन से माइंस बंद हो रहे हैं, कौन से पावर प्लांट्स बंद होने वाले हैं, कहाँ पर कितने इनफॉर्मल इकोनॉमी वर्कर्स है, इनके कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स क्या है हर एक माइन पे. 5 साल में can we collect the data to get some amount of trend of how this will work at the district level? Because without understanding that, it's going to become very difficult. The UK started, the peak of coal consumption in the UK was in the 1920s. Till date, UK is still transitioning. The peak of coal consumption in Germany was in 1960s. Till date, Germany is transitioning. We've not even come to the peak of coal consumption in India. So you can imagine the challenge that rests in front of us going forward. So this was something that we put together to try and get a sense of what is the induced dependency of a district on coal. This is going to come up in the next couple of months. I will stop here, take questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Swati. I see there is a hand raised. Abhijit, do you want to keep it brief in the interest of time?
Sure. So I want to kind of bring, it's more of a comment than a question. The fact of the matter is the markets will move, the solutions will come, hydrogen is coming, whether it's nuclear comes, the industry will move out and consolidation will happen. So all of that is going to happen. It's just a matter of time. It's not if, it's when. And so most of the economies, the modern economies are transitioning coal for 50, 60 years. India has less than that time. So in the next 20 years, I can tell you that hydrogen will be cheaper than coal and most of the industry would have moved to hydrogen. I can bet on that, literally. And the second piece of it is that India has a huge population, which is basically too many hands doing the same job, underqualified to migrate into the new economy of green technologies. So in that situation, the major problem that I see is not having understanding of what this population is about, what's the size of this population, and how we're going to transition them to a better performing job, or how we're going to upskill them. That whole thing depends on understanding what this kind of dynamics of this population is. The other thing is there's a lot of sunk cost. A lot of this population won't transition, and a lot of this population won't even survive. And at the rate of the pollution that we are going, killing 2 million people every year. So looking at it, if you take your sunk cost out and you say, look, I'm going to save my next generation and I'm going to move them from those places where these mines are or steel factories are, and I'm going to educate them to a better job. So in 20 years, by the time we are in that transition mode, this population has already moved into newer jobs, and we don't have to worry about cleaning our previous mess. I think it has to be a forward-looking approach rather than looking at what these people are going to. India will have to take this sunken cost. There is no way we can save so many people, hundreds of millions of people out of this economy, because going forward, the economy is not going to support so many people.
The problem over here is the industry will move on. I completely understand, Abhijit, your point. The industry will move on because if you look at Tata Steel, if you look at major conglomerates, and we have a handful of those, all of them have actually started experimenting with cleaner technology. Tata Steel in their European plant has actually started trying to figure CCUS. Their Indian plant has not. So I have no doubt that the industry will move on. But the number of people that major conglomerates employ versus the entire supply chain of informal economy, your MSME clusters in Ludhiana, in Punjab, MSME clusters in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa that are dependent on the fossil fuel economy with very low margins. And they are the ones that are actually going to have a lot of difficulty in moving on when we are looking at a green transition without actually incentivizing them to do this.
Yes, and I think basically the thing is, people are on their own. They have to understand Indian government
Vijit,
is
I'm
not going to
really
help them this
sorry.
one.
You know, I butt in every time, but
Sure.
I would not like to make this a dialogue between the speaker
Sure,
and
sure,
yourself,
sure.
if you don't mind. Yeah,
Yeah,
I will pass it
absolutely.
on to Shivani.
Thank you, Aarti. And I think Jaideep has his hand up since a long time. So I'll request Jaideep if you can unmute yourself. I think you've been unmuted. So if you can ask a question.
My concern was, since we are supposed to report from Jharkhand, and when we discuss on all these aspects, my only focus is that from where to get the opinion of the lawmakers, policymakers, and all. After this discussion, I think that if we ask any government person that, are you going to shut down this mine? Are you going to shut down this power plant? I think they would ask us, from where did you get this clue all about? We are not going to shut down anything. Maybe the prime minister has said to phase down coal, but this is not even a part of discussion in state government. Means nobody, I think they would follow central governments if they come up with any rule or law or regulation. But for going ahead and taking a step to close down coal production, no, I don't think so. It is going to be anywhere. No government will take this risk, no state government. So in that case, how are we going to project this discussion? Means if we are talking about mines shutting down, power sector shutting down, means thermal power sector, or brick kilns shutting down, no, means I wouldn't find anybody who will accept my logic that yes, they are going to shut down in near future. They would say, you are living in a fool's paradise. Nothing is going to shut down. It's nothing going to happen. So we are here for at least 30, 40 years. Can't you see the UMPP is coming up? Can't you see we have just given clearance to 29 coal mine projects? How to write our reports in that case?
You know, Jaideep, when I was working on this study, and I was speaking to labor unions, one of the representative told me, "आप क्या झूठ बोल रहे हो? हम तो 80 साल तक कोयला बंद नहीं करने वाले हैं, और अभी तो हमको मैंडेट मिला है कि प्रोडक्शन बढ़ाओ। आप कहाँ से आके बोल रहे हो कि ये प्रोडक्शन बंद होने वाला है और हमको इसके बारे में सोचना चाहिए?" So I completely understand your problem. Not one person across any of these industries, forget the government, not even within the industries, not one person that I spoke to were like, oh, this is going to happen. Everybody was like, हाँ 20-30 साल में होने वाला है. We are thinking about it, we are planning for it, but dekha jayega. Like it's a very huge dekha jayega. And you are absolutely right that at the government level, at the state government level, you are not going to today get an answer on the fact that you know key mines band hone wale hai ya power plants band hone wale hai, because short term gains elections, nobody is going to give you that answer. What could be useful is to keep bringing up cases where these mines have already been shut or are in the process of shutting down, and highlight what kind of impact it is currently having on local communities. Because from the research side, hum kya kar rahe hain? We are trying to engage the government in this conversation. In the last 3 months, the Ministry of Coal has finally agreed with World Bank to prepare a mine closure framework. So the government movement on this is very slow. I don't think, given the net zero target, most ministries are still discussing how to incorporate net zero in their own sectoral projections. So abhi tak everything is very up in the air, and like barring talking about what is going to happen today and why that becomes a precursor for what is going to come, could possibly be a good way to increase the the awareness of people. But it's a very, very long road and not a very easy one, even from like a research perspective. So from a journalist perspective, even more difficult.
Thanks a lot.
So there are no more hands raised. If I'll just pause for a minute if there are any questions, otherwise we can take a short half-an-hour break for lunch, and I hope all of you will stay back because this is a very lively discussion, and there is a lot to be sort of spoken about even in the second half of this workshop. Jaideep ji, do you have another question, or was your hand raised from earlier?
It was raised from earlier, I think.
All right, no worry. So should we take this as a cue to break for lunch, about 30 minutes, and we can regroup by 1:25, so we can start at 1:30 sharp.
Should we end this call, Shivani, or can we just mute ourselves and come back in 15, 20 minutes?
We can
then?
mute ourselves.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Thanks, Pati.
Thank you, Aarti. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See
you.
Bye.
थैंक यू। और सब लोगों से हम मिलते हैं आधे घंटे में एक ब्रेक के बाद। अपने सभी मीडिया के साथियों से हमारी रिक्वेस्ट है कि प्लीज आप लोग आधे घंटे में जरूर से वापस इसी लिंक पे यहीं आ जाइए। थैंक यू।
And yes, I'll just hand over to Mayank.
Just give me a second.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I have been asked to discuss the media side of it in terms of how to cover just transition in Jharkhand. So I just have a couple of quick points, and then I would like to discuss with everyone around, because I don't think there's much to say. But can I just share my screen for a minute?
Yes, please.
So before I start, I just wanted to say that the speakers before me have actually set the context properly. Whether it is Sandeep or Shrestha or Swati, they have actually discussed in quite detail what just transition means in the global context, what it means in India, how we need to look at the ecosystem when it comes to just transition, what are the elements and the years and everything. So I think that actually sets the stage for me. I would just like to say that when MongoDB India, like I'm working for MongoDB India, and when MongoDB India started looking at the subject, we actually tried to shift away from the usual global meaning of just transition, where we're only looking at the transition of communities from coal to clean. What we actually did was to look at just transition from the perspective of, say, a community, from the perspective of environment, people who can't, like the beings that can't speak, and it is not just the transition from coal to clean. We also looked at the transition of environment in communities, whether it was just or not, in context of past, present, and future of mining. So that has been our focus area, and in that context, we have covered a lot of stories, and we have covered the subject across the country. I'll share some examples, and then I'll come to make the points that I have some suggestions, because to be honest, I think there are very, very able journalists right now out there who are doing amazing work on the subject. I don't need to tell how to cover. I can just share my own experience, that what we did and why what we did. For example, the way we have been looking at, I'll just share some of the stories that we have done in the series. So we did this part about, say, the solar pump, which talks about how from the traditional pumps, the shift to solar pump, how that made a difference. So that also we counted under the subject of just transition, because ultimately we are looking at transitioning away from whether it is like mines or the use of coal. That is how we started looking at it. Then there was a question I remember about whether there's a good example of a mine reclamation project in India. So there's a project that we looked at in Jharkhand. And we found that it was just one of the projects, but our research and our stories over the last 1.5 years or 2 years have shown that there is there is actually very rare example of a mine reclamation done right. In fact, a recent research by NFI, which was actually led by Kavya and Swati from the National Foundation of India, showed that over 100 mines were closed in the last 12 years. And there is probably not even one example where somebody can come and claim that the mine reclamation was done right. Then we did on mica mining. We looked at the progress on clean energy. We looked at how it is about to be like, if you look at the whole ecosystem, and if you look at every stakeholder involved directly or indirectly, how it is going to be a very messy exercise, because considering our past experience and considering our authorities, the myopic view of they are looking at in terms of stuff, how it is going to be a very messy affair. We also looked at the possibility of floating solar plants on water bodies. We looked at the issue from the perspective of gender, which is something that I've discovered is rarely done in this sector. And we also looked at India trying to get funds from across outside world to gain access to money to develop frameworks, and so on and so forth. So why I wanted to show this, to be honest, is wait. Okay, how to go about it? Okay. So my idea and my suggestion, or whatever I've discovered, is from my experience in media from the last 15, 16 years, is this, that if you start looking at a subject and just try and talk about from that one particular subject's point of view, say अगर आप सिर्फ just transition बोल के किसी भी खबर को लिखना चाहें और हर चीज पे बात करना चाहें, तो हो सकता है कई बार because of so many agendas and so many pulls and pushes आप उस story को ना लिख पाएं. पर मतलब मुझे लगता है कि एक जो तरीका मैंने पिछले 10 सालों में 12 साल में जब से मैं एनवायरनमेंट पे लिख रहा हूँ तब से मैंने जो देखा है, वो मुझे समझ आता है कि अगर आप कान को सीधा ना पकड़ के टेढ़ा तरीके से पकड़े या वो पीछे से पकड़े, या मतलब आप जरूरी नहीं कि एक इशू को जस्ट ट्रांजिशन को आपको हर इशू में जस्ट ट्रांजिशन की बात ही करनी है, आप उसको बहुत सारी तरीके से आप उसको चूज कर सकते हो. आप यू कैन एक्चुअली अप्रोच द सब्जेक्ट फ्रॉम सो मेनी पॉसिबल एंगल्स. इनफैक्ट excuse the pun, but I think it's a mine of stories for journalists. When just the subject is a just transition, we approach the subject as just transition. For example, in a recent conversation, I was referring that, when we look at the subject of just transition, why do we just need to look at from the perspective of coal or ecosystem? There is so much of stuff that we actually can approach this subject from. And for example, say we can look at from the perspective of union, we can look at from perspective of labor, we can say look at from the perspective of transition to cleaner form, we can look at from the perspective of say DMF money that is being collected. We can see that how much DMF money was collected, whether that money has actually gone to the particular area. We can also see that whether the government is actually putting any money in those particular districts, coal dependent districts, where DMF is being collected from, and beyond the DMF money. Because a lot of times what we have discovered while writing our stories is that, say a district is earning X amount through DMF. In that context, the governments and the authorities in that particular district stop spending money, their own, like the budget money, and they completely rely on the DMF money to develop the area or to give the basic facilities in that area. And say then we can look at from the livelihood strategy of the people involved in the whole ecosystem. That's something that Sandeep and Swati and Shrishta have been talking about, and even written their research like several times. We can even look at from the perspective of, say, in news, when we talk about news, we generally only focus on, say, what is the new thing. We forget a lot of times to hold people and authorities accountable for what has been done. So say, if we look at Jharkhand as an area, we can easily, like for a journalist, we can, rather than saying just transition and rather than focusing on that keyword, why not look at the areas where coal mining or mining of any sort has been going on for years, and why not ask the question that whether all the promises that those companies, the authorities had made about implementation of land laws, rehabilitation laws, what environment laws, or say resettlement, whether those promises were fulfilled or not. Say, why not look at an area that in the last 20 years, since the mining is happening in one particular subject, a district, why not try and take stock of things that happen in that area? Why not try and understand what exactly went in, what exactly the transition of that area, how that area transitioned from a place where mining was not there or a place that was full of forest, and how the place looks like today. So why not understand how the whole place changed, how the whole place transitioned, and hold people accountable for how it had to be done? Why not look at it from the perspective of skills? Why not look at the whole story from the perspective of political economy? Why not look at it from the perspective of how different acts which were supposed to work for that particular area, say if an area comes under PESA, Schedule 5, whether those laws were followed, whether gender lens was actually implemented while looking at stories. Why not look at from the perspective of the impact of mining, the transition of mining activities, whether it is like transition mining activities, and even if you look at the clean energy transition when we talk about the renewable projects, why not look at from the perspective of whether coal mining or renewable project, the impact they have on, say, water, land, agriculture, communities, wildlife, everyone involved. Because I remember in one of the stories that we even did, we talked about how a mining project, a bauxite mining project, is actually threatening India's lone wolf sanctuary and an interstate river, which is on the border of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. So, and we also, like when we talk about coal economy and we talk about the transition from coal to renewable, we only talk about that how this whole transition is actually going to play out. We also can actually a lot of times I think we forget to link it to climate change, not just in terms of emissions. We also forget to look at the impact. We can look at the resource efficiency for a media person, narrative and discourse. See, in fact, what I have discovered while interacting with my colleagues on the ground in states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, that when you work for media organizations on the ground, we forget and we look at a very top-down approach. We sit in, say, very comfortable positions in cities like Delhi, Mumbai, and we talk about how media should do stuff there in Jharkhand and how media should do stuff in that particular district. We forget the challenges that they are facing in terms of their own organizations, their support that they get. So I think there is also a huge opportunity for everyone, all the stakeholders involved, to work with those media organizations, to work with the journalists on the ground and help them in capacity building. It's a very abused word, capacity building, but I really mean it in terms of probably handholding or working with them to understand their concerns, because we feel that just transitions or the whole issue of transition can actually be covered in one particular way only. But if you look at from the ground, I feel that there are a lot of ways that we can address the issue without probably even naming just transition. Because what happens in media discourse, I have seen, or what I have experienced, that when you start looking at a subject from one perspective, sooner or later the media organization gets bored of it because of that new angle. So rather than getting, to avoid that trap of somebody saying that you are not getting any new stories for a journalist, when somebody like a journalist hears from the boss or from the media barons that this story is not new, this story has been talked about. So rather than pursuing the story from only that perspective, I think Jharkhand gives a superb opportunity in terms of how everything revolves around the use of resources and how those resources are being used. So if you look at coal as a huge, very significant resource in Jharkhand, we can actually play around, or we can actually design a whole media work or the media coverage in the state, whether it is from the perspective of say communities involved, environmental factors involved, the ecosystem services from those environmental like say forest and water bodies, and from the perspective of health. So every single beat that a media organization covers or looks at, I think can actually become one of the vehicles for just transition narrative. And because this is what we have been trying at Monger Bay India, to look at the intersection of mining issues or the transition issues with politics, with environment, with health, with biodiversity, with laws, with regulatory stuff, everything and every single thing that we can think of we have been trying to look at the stories from that intersection. And I think that way Jharkhand gives us a very, very important, very significant opportunity Jharkhand provides us. Because as Swati was saying, I remember Swati just in her presentation, Swati was saying that if you look at India's energy policies, more or less they are decided by the center. Even if they are implemented by the state, they are driven by center. So whether it is the coal target, or say whether it is a target of renewable power, ultimately everything is being driven by the central government. So we can also look at from the perspective of center versus state, how that whole relation is being played out. So in nutshell, what I just want to convey that rather than only looking from looking at just transition from the perspective of say how this whole transition is playing out, we can actually look at the whole ecosystem of stories around the whole issue, where they connect to each other, and whether it is the politics, environment, everything. And yeah, I think in a nutshell, this is what I wanted to convey. I'm open to any queries that anybody may have.
Thank you for that, Mayank, and thank you for your superb coverage. I think your stories also speak to what you sort of mentioned, that there are so many facets and aspects to just transition, that it's there's an opportunity for journalists to also look at that at a local level, at a regional level, and as sort of Shrestha and Swati also emphasized, that each region is sort of different, so it doesn't mean that if it's covered in one place, it's irrelevant in another. So I'll just pause there and see if there are any hands raised, or if there are any questions in the chat box, or if anybody wants to sort of unmute themselves and ask, that's also fine.
Before we'll wait for somebody to ask anything, and if not, I'll just add a couple of more points that we while discussing this subject we have discovered that when we looked at this subject, we can also look at it from the perspective of rural transition. A lot of times when we look at the subjects, whether mining or say renewable power, we end up looking majorly from the perspective of somebody living in a city. We forget that we are looking at rural and semi-rural areas, semi-urban areas, and we also need to look at the whole perspective of people and their aspirations, people who are living in the areas and their aspirations, how they are looking at development and how they are looking at urbanization and how they are looking at transition from rural to semi-urban area kind of stuff. So we also need to understand this whole human perspective, this whole people perspective, and this transition that a rural area is undergoing. So let's not limit, this is what I feel and this is what I see, that it's like in journalism, the basic says that, talk to your audience, talk to your reader in a language that they understand. So if you will just continue hammering just transition, obviously, yes, it will go down and people will understand there's something called just transition, but at the end of the day, people get bored. This is the nature of news. If you continue just hammering one thing, like one after another, same thing every day in that same language, I'm not saying don't propagate the same work or say like the same subject, but probably we need to look at how we reach out to people in terms of the language and in terms of how we approaching the subject. If we just continue doing the same thing, people will get bored and people will move on to other news, because that is the nature of news. That is how we consume information. That is how we consume information, consume news. So if we just need to tweak it to look at the audience and to look at how we want to propagate a particular subject. Like I remember a lot of energy stories, when we look at different things impact different communities. Some communities are impacted by when you write about the animal they love. Some communities are happy to read about the subject when you talk about from the perspective of, say, their favorite river, the forest, the deity in the forest, or say from the perspective of job, from the perspective of youth. And I think one area that is majorly missing, and we need to go all guns blazing on that, is I think from the gender perspective. We are failing to address this whole issue of just transition and mining and clean energy transition, well, no matter what you call it, what name you want to give it. we are failing to address it from the perspective of gender, even when they are driving the whole thing, and even when they are the unsung warriors of this whole game. I think we are just not doing this. I think we need to focus a lot on that from that perspective.
Absolutely. I think as Swati and Shrestha also emphasized, that there is the lack of understanding even in terms of how many women are there, and most fall in the informal and contract segment of mining. So I think there is the opportunity to, have that understanding, to sort of go on ground and see where are the opportunities and what are the implications on gender, and maybe even class and sort of caste, most importantly in India. So those are facets that, and of course, like you said, most of the policies are sort of top down, from even from within India, it's from the center to the state. So a bottom up approach, a listening exercise is very, very important to understand the aspirations of those who are going to actually be transitioned out. So yes, thank you for that.
Last thing before I stop, I just say that we need to just acknowledge a great number of reporters, whether in cities or in these rural areas or semi-rural areas, semi-urban areas. We need to acknowledge that people, despite all difficulties of media, are doing amazing work. We just need, as communicators or as journalists or as and like anybody, fellow journalists, we just need to probably work with them and learn from them in what they are doing and work together. That's all I just wanted to say. Yeah.
Absolutely true. So I don't see any questions either in the chat or hands raised, but if there are any questions that may come in retrospect, please do send them across and we'll try to have them answered. With that, we'll sort of move on to Dr. Rakesh Singh, and he's from, Life, as Aarti introduced earlier. I'll just hand it over to you, Rakesh Ji. You have so much experience in the area of forest biodiversity, but also from the legal angle of decommissioning of urban power plants. So there's the other aspect of that as well. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Thanks, Ivani. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah. See, since morning we are talking about the Jharkhand issue, and I heard various speakers. Yes, Jharkhand as a state is it's very difficult as we think about the transition. And I'm only worried with one issue, that this word should not become a word while we are just discussing in AC room. Because when we are talking about the Jharkhand, we have to look on the political perspective, local community, everything. So far since 2000, when the Jharkhand was separated, unfortunately, there was not a single stable government, and there's so much of the corruptions. And this coal mining is one of the major, like the source for illegal earning of political parties. So that is the one challenge, but I'm not going into that. And Shrestha was talking about Ramgarh, I think. And lots of issue was discussed about that coal collector. I don't know how to address those issues, because these are the people, those who are involved in the mining, that is all illegal activities. They are not the legally, they are doing all the abandoned mines and the mines which are already there, they just go and collect. And that's why there are so much of the cycle wala in that area, because the poverty is very high in Jharkhand. And if you give even the opportunity, there is a serious doubt how many of them is going to shift. Yes, but one issue is very important with respect to Jharkhand if we are talking about the just transition, and that issue unfortunately have been not looked into in depth. Jharkhand is having about 30% of the forest area, and most of the mining is coming in the forest area. And these tribals are also having the dependency on the MFP collection. But so far, Jharkhand, I think, is the only state where the MFP is not properly collected and marketed. So there is no system of, collection and the marketing. And that is the one of the scopes. So when we are talking about the transition and the community benefit, if somehow we can, promote this for systematic MFP collection and its marketing, then I think the community will go, because that is their traditional practice. So that is the one thing. But now I'm coming to the topic which was given to me about the coal-fired thermal power plant. Can I share my screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Just a minute. Let me find where is the teaching. Is it visible to everyone?
It is now.
Yeah. See, when we are talking about the decommissioning of coal-fired thermal power plants, let's have a look what the trend is there in country with respect to the coal-fired thermal power plant. Yeah. Say from 1962, this coal-fired thermal power plant, the record is available with the Central Electricity Authority, that is a CA. And the jump which has taken place, that is basically from the 2007 onwards. There is a sharp change in the installed capacity of the coal-fired thermal power plant in India. And the peak was somewhere in the 2015, 16 and 17. That was the peak. Now it's showing a downtrend. So that is the one good part, that there is a downtrend is there. But the power plant which has installed 2010 onwards, they are going to be exist in this country for I don't know how many years, in next how many decades, because as per one of the CA document, they says that the coal-fired thermal power plants generally lose its efficiency, and after the 1,60,000 hours of the working, there are so much of the problem is there. So the average cycle is 15 to 20 years. But if we look the retirement data, that is not happening. See, this is the graph which I have just pulled down yesterday. See, the green one is basically the thermal power plant which retired. So if you see, even of the 1979 plants, 80, 81, those who are installed, that is still in operation. So I do not know how they are going to retire for these plants, despite CA is saying that the units have the, like they lose the efficiency if they work for more than the 1 lakh hours of the operations. Now, if we see the last 4 years where the maximum, the retirements took place, and that is also, there is so much of imbalance. The retirement is taking place, say, in 2018, only 1,779 megawatt was retired, but the installed was 6,320. Even in the current year till now, only 1,260 megawatt got retired, but 5,920 megawatt is a new installed capacity that happened this year. So that is the one thing. Now coming to the what is the like provisions that we are having. So if we take about the recently NGT has constituted a committee, and after that committee, what they are saying, they have submitted a report in which the CPCB was their Ministry of, I'm just closing this. Okay. So, so the committee has given the report, and they were actually, NGT has asked this committee to develop a guidelines for decommissioning of the coal-fired thermal power plant. But that is very surprising. If you read the report of the committee, they had not given a very specific guidelines how to go for a retirement of a thermal power plant. They have just said in the report that in last 5 years, 9,908 megawatt got retired, and in the near future, only the 14 units, which is having a total installed capacity of 1,988 megawatt, will get retired. There is also CA is having one of the report which says modernization and the life extension of the thermal power plant. In that report, they have very clearly says that 25 to 30 years is the life cycle of most of the thermal power plant in India. But as I showed in your graph, that even the thermal power plant, which is now 40 years, 50 years, that is still running. And the CA has no other mechanism how to handle it and go for a retirement plan. But at the same time, they are having one rule, that is the Indian Boiler Regulation Act 1950. Under this particular regulation of 391A, it says that testing of boiler is required if they achieve, the life, if they have worked for 1 lakh hours of the operation of the boiler, those who work more than the 400 degrees Celsius. So, but currently, there is no document in public domain in which we can see and analyze how many boilers of this thermal power plant has gone into that particular evaluation and what is their status. If we push for that, then suddenly we will be having a very clear idea how many of these units are really worth to continue or they should get retired. There is another their plan, they says that first the CA is going to prioritize only the unit capacity which is having 110 megawatt of the reheat type, or the 200 or 210 megawatt, which is economically not viable, they are going to retire. But if you look the data, there are very few thermal power plants today exist in India, which is having such a low capacity. Most of them are already retired. And what the prioritization they have done that if the heat rate is deviation is more than 20%, then they will first take those boilers for the retirement. And next time, if there is a deviation of 15 to 10%, then they will change the design to go for a other grade of coal. And if they don't get the suitable grade of coal, then only they will retire. So there is a big dilemma here, how to go about this. In the Jharkhand perspective, today we see Jharkhand is producing only the 4,250 megawatt of the electricity. And till now, only the 2 units has been was retired. One is in 2021, one is in 2020. 2020, which was retired, that was established in 1968, that is of 130 megawatt. And in 2021, that is a unit which got retired, is 2010 megawatt. Patratu also got retired, old one, but now Patratu is coming with the new capacity, that is the 3 into 800 megawatt, means the 2400 megawatt of the power plant. That one is coming up in Patratu, that is in Ramgarh. And Adani is also constructing one thermal power plant in Godda, that is of 1600 megawatt capacity. So this is the overall situation about this. As far as Act is concerned, all talks about that, okay, you have to follow Air Act, you have to follow Water Act, you have to follow Solid Waste. So these are the act which is already there. So I don't see there is a very concrete steps taken by the government to devise or develop a policies about how to retire this thermal power plant. So that is the one of the issue. Another issue is with regard to the coal mining in Jharkhand. I tried to find out how much of the coal is excavated from the Jharkhand state to feed the various thermal power plants. So only closing mines will not solve problem if that thermal power plant is still paying. Like I know the Dadri, which is running in Delhi, NCR, they are getting coal from the North Karanpura. So if the Dadri is still in functional, then the mining in North Karanpura will happen. Similarly, the new coal blocks, the area which is very much virgin in Jharkhand, like that is near the Palamau, that is in Latehar and Chandwa district. The new coal block has been given to the DVC. So DVC, their thermal power plants, they are going to excavate. And if that particular greenfield projects will come in that particular portion of the landscape, then it will destroy the entire wildlife connectivity towards, the eastern part and the northern part in Jharkhand from the Palamau Tiger Reserve. So these are the very complex. So in nutshell, what I can say that we have to push, if we are talking about the just transition, coal mining is having a very clear-cut guidelines. That is a mine closure plan. But with regard to the thermal power plant, still India has not come up with any policy, any guidelines, any document, how to go ahead with this, because there is so much of the ambiguity. In one stage, they say 25 to 30 years, 25 to 30 years will be the life cycle. After that, the thermal power plants, is having the problem, so that should get retired. But at the same time, they are saying that life expectancy can be increased after inspection of the boiler. But so far, there is no result or no reports CA has published with regard to the boiler efficiency and their status. So these are all about very short details which I can say about the thermal power plants, because currently we do not have anything to say or to critique all these policies, because just now in November, last month only, the NGT report has been submitted in NGT, and even that report is not worth to even critique, because it's a very generalized. It says you have to follow Air Act, you have to follow Water Act, you have to follow Solid Waste, you have to go for a hazardous waste. So that those are the acts which is already existing, and anyhow, any of the industry, whether you shut down or not, you have to follow those rules and acts, and you have to work accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakesh ji. I was just wondering, you mentioned at the end that in terms of legalities, there's either no notifications, or there's no sort of clear legal guidance, or it's ambiguous. And I'm wondering what might be useful for anybody who's communicating on the issue from the legal perspective. What are the things they can keep in mind and look for, given sometimes very dense either notifications or sometimes contradictory notifications that might be coming in. If there are any pointers that you think might be useful to add here before we open it up for questions.
See, what I think we have to wait for this NGT Southern Bench decision, that final decision, because just now the report has been submitted. Let's see what the NGT is giving the direction to the CPCB. Most likely, if suppose few more people can file an intervention and we can talk about that, to just pressurize the Central Pollution Control Board about drafting the complete guidelines about the decommissioning. But again, if the CA is not framing a rule when to retire a thermal power plant, then whatever the policy will make, that is not going to be implemented. So here the role of the Central Electricity Regulatory Authority, their role is very important. First, to develop a framework. After how many years they are going to retire this?
Right. So I guess we just have to wait for some of these issues to come in. I mean, notifications to come in before any clear reporting can be done. I'll pause here to see if there are any hands raised or if there are any questions. Shushmita, you had some observation. Is this something you want to talk about, the Samata judgment? All right, maybe not. So if not, I'll hand over to Jaideep. His hand has been raised.
I had one question. When we are talking about this thermal power plant phase down, can we have the figures that how many thermal power plants are right now working in Jharkhand? And
yeah, I can tell you. Just a minute. Wait, I will just give you the data. Just a minute. Hold on. See, Jharkhand is having currently 13 units are operational in Jharkhand. And if you talk about the thermal power plant, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 thermal power plant.
Can I have the capacity and their location, these 7 thermal plants?
Yeah. See, the DBC one is a Bokaro A thermal power plant. That is near the Bokaro. Okay. Second one is in Chandrapura. They are running with the 500 megawatt. Then the Kodarma is having the 1000 megawatt. Then Adunik is having, that is in Saraikela Kharsawa, that is a 540. Then the Tata Power is having 240. Then there is again Tata Power is having 1050, and then the Tenugat is having the 420 megawatt.
Thanks so much. This Tata Power both are located, means geographically they are at?
Where? Which one?
Tata Power.
See, Tata Power one is in near Jamshedpur. That is a 240 megawatt.
Okay.
And there is a Mathan that is near the West Bengal. That is a 1050.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Rakesh, would it be possible for you to share these details?
I can share.
The rest of us. Yeah.
Actually, I am just following entire, from the CA, how much unit has been retired in every month and how much is added. So since that, I was following it for last 5 years actually.
One more thing, Rakesh ji. can you just tell the 2 units that you said they were retired recently?
It's not the link. Actually, what you have to go, you have to create the, because long back what I did, actually I created a baseline data. And then I'm adding it and retiring it. So what you can go, you can actually do, you can go to the CA website. There is a monthly installed capacity report they generate, and in which they say which are the units they are retiring and which are the units they have installed it.
Dr. Rakeshji, 2 questions. One,
Yeah.
do you know what's the total number of units will be retired over the next 10 years, and how much of that will be replaced with thermal power?
See, that's the issue, because there is no clear-cut policies. No one can say which are the units they are going to retire.
Okay. So is that
CA,
intentional?
CA is also not clear, because if the CA, you just go with the CA document, this is modernization and the life expectancy report. They are not bringing out any report what should be the retirement policy. And I was wondering that in their report, they themselves are saying that if the unit has worked for more than 1,60,000 hours, then that should be retired, because there is so much of the wear, tear, and there is a chances of accident. So if you talk about even the health, the safety issue, I think there is a problem. So CA has to come up with a very clear-cut guidelines how to tackle with the old thermal power plants. Because the data which I am having, I was just looking even the units which was established, say in just a minute, I'm telling you, 1970, yeah, see 74, 445 megawatt was installed, only the 94 got retired.
So what is the basis of those retirements? Like, what is the law around it, right? So CA.
There is no law. What they are actually doing it, which I have understood with the so much of the data which is available. If they see that the PLF, peak load factor, is going very down because the boiler is of old design and they are not able to produce enough electricity, they go for a replacement for change in technology, and they are coming with a new unit there.
So they just modernize it.
That is the reason this year what happened, the retirement is very less. See, only the 1,260 megawatt got retired, but the new unit which is added, that is a total sum of 5,920 megawatt.
Right. So what is that media can do here? Can they kind of create a synergistic
Yes, media,
set of articles?
basically media, I think the media role is very important, particularly with the perspective of the Central Electricity Authority. The article must be written to, to create certain type of pressure on CA to come up with their clear policies with regard to the old thermal power plants. Either they are going to change the boiler, or making some under the Boiler Act, just they will go for a evaluation and they will continue, or they are going to come up with some cutoff deadline that okay, those who are 50 years old we are going to retire, those who are 30 years old that we are going to retire. So they must come up with those criteria. Then only we will be having a very clear picture.
So I've got a quick question. Given government's work methods, it seems like it's intentional. So in order to force them to actually make it right, there are only 2 ways. One is obviously media and public uproar, but the other is going to court. So what would be the process from your perspective?
See, one thing is certainly the court is a one solution that we are having. If everything fails, then suddenly the court is the only option that we have to go. And so that is the only option. That is the only option we are having. But what actually I was thinking, because yesterday only I come across with the order of the Southern Bench, which they have done it. So I will try to dig out the entire petition, what actually the matter went into the National Green Tribunal. And after looking that, then it will be good to develop a strategy how to intervene in that case and then, take up it further.
Okay. So how soon we should have this stuff figured out from your perspective?
Currently, it is a very difficult to say because that figure, I don't know, because the government is saying, okay, no new thermal power plant we will going to establish. But with regard to existing one, there is no clarity. Because as I see on this Parivesh portal, there are actually the thermal power plant, if we see, just a minute, in the entire country, I can tell you. Currently, we are how many are under the pipeline? See, only the 42. So currently, if you go with the thermal power plant, only one project is pending at the project proponent side. All have got the clearances. So today or tomorrow, they are going to come up.
So is there any public hearing on these CA documents at all that you give opinions as public?
See, the public hearing, only one I can tell you which plant is that. That one is also Andaman and Nicobar, 50 megawatt dual field base. So currently, I don't think there is any project which is pending at the ministry side for new thermal power plant. All has got the recommendation. Just a minute. For TOR, let me see. TOR may be the one thing. So 79 accepted, 66 was granted. So only the 4 are pending actually. That is the current status, 4 and 1 5 actually.
Okay.
So 2 is pending at the project proponent side, 1 is under the ministry's this thing, and 1 is not accepted. So basically what we can do, only on the 3 project, some public hearing intervention can go.
Okay.
That is one is a 600, 3 into 600 megawatt in the Mahanadi, that is in Chhattisgarh. That is a Jangir Champa, and Tirupura is 120 megawatt, but I think this one is a gas one. So that will also not work. And another one is, that is a captive. So that is a very small, so 8 megawatt. So currently only the one proposal is there of the Odisha, where there is an opportunity to go for a public hearing, because these projects will come for the TOR. And then after the TOR, the public hearing will start. So that time there is a chances to go for public hearing concern that can be raised.
Okay.
So thank you for that, for your questions, Abhijit, and also patiently and in detail responding to these, Rakeshji. If there are no further questions, I think let's hand it over to Manjari, who's going to speak to us about communicating via Twitter and the best practices and the best ways of sort of ensuring your voices are heard through this channel.
Okay, thank you, Shivani.
Thank you, Rakeshji.
Thank you, Shivani. Thank you, everyone. It's been a super stimulating discussion. I was totally glued in. And I guess we always run out of time, no matter how long these sessions are. I'll just quickly share my screen and jump right into it. Shivani, you'll have to tell me if it can be visible. Yeah, tell me when I make it full screen. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I just thought of, and obviously everyone's already made such a great presentation, and and Mayank has also spoken very clearly about what needs to be communicated when we do talk about energy transition. And I'm just talking in capacity of a person who just uses digital tools to just push forward the climate action development. And I thought I'll start with just talking about a report that's recently come out. And the report basically mentions that during COP26, there were a bunch of climate misinformation adverts that were being run, and they were being run for many months. And it's just become such a polarizing and political tool, just misinformation and disinformation content online, a tool to really just slow down and weaken the climate impact work that everyone's doing here collectively, and to really slow down the progress on climate action. So I just wanted to say this out loud because in India, the situation is slightly different. We're maybe a few steps behind, because climate misinformation is not such a big problem yet. The bigger problem being really lack of understanding of climate issues, the many nuances, and just the knowledge and the broad discussion around climate change really is still missing. And climate conversations are still, largely sitting outside the economic or political discourse in India, which is why it becomes super important for more credible voices to just pop up on the internet, talking about issues from a really balanced and informed perspective. So I think as journalists and as experts and as just people who care about climate issues and really want a just energy transition in India, I think it's really important for us to continuously and consistently push out the right kind of content on the channels and just be present. And that's one way to sort of drown out all the misinformation. Excuse me. And since misinformation as a concept is really not yet quite caught on in India, so we have that opportunity to just fill that space with more factual, scientific, and like really up-to-date information. So having said that, I'll just, we've just developed this really small handbook, and I hope everyone's already has it, or if not, it can be shared and hopefully will be useful. We just wanted to really talk about how we can use Twitter as a space to keep pushing forward the right kind of messaging around climate action and energy transition. Since we are in that, oh my God, can you just give me a second? I'm so sorry. This is just downside of working from home remotely. There may be a doorbell also. Right. So I just thought, and everyone can really take their time and go through this handbook. Broadly, just to talk about what's in it is to really explore the different sections on Twitter to really maximize your presence by really following the trends closely, connecting with the right people. I'm really not going to go through how to set up the profile and such. It's really very in plain words written there. But really to engage with your readers is an important thing that we can do and journalists can do. Because traditional TV broadcasts and newspapers is more or less a one-way communication. With being on Twitter and similar platforms can really give you an opportunity to have a two-way conversation with your readers as well. So that sort of develops more trust in the kind of work that journalists do if they are presenting their stories and adding more perspectives to it, adding a new angle when they do share their stories, and everyone really wants to hear it from the horse's mouth. So it's really a good idea to connect with the right people, connect with the experts, not just put information out there, but also seek the right kind of information, and really just to keep an eye on what new is brewing and what could potentially be a new conversation or a new topic to talk about or to cover. I've really broken down each kind of content that can be put out as well. Please take your time and go through this, and very happy to assist later on as well. Some of the other tools, maybe I'll just really talk about just the need to use more media, and not just retweeting things, but always try to add a statement or an opinion, and try to do more long form tweet threads as well. That's really engaging, and that gives you an opportunity to really dive into a subject. And I think another couple of things would be just to explore some other pro tools, like starting a newsletter or even hosting Twitter Spaces. And that's that. I really did not go through each page, and I'm going to hand it over to Shivani, and also happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Manjari. I think you can get the door, and we'll see if there are any questions in the meanwhile. I think thank you for sort of covering this in a very brief way. Many of you who are communicating, who are using Twitter to either follow the news on climate or even communicate on it, somewhat familiar, but it's this is the way to sort of, as Manjari has pointed out, there are various aspects of Twitter that can be explored. There's the threads, which are much more engaging, and there is the aspect of Twitter Spaces, which is relatively new and is also sort of picking up in terms of short discussions that are being planned, and it's quite a nice and interesting space. But if there are any specific either technical questions or strategic questions with regard to the use of Twitter, please do ask away while Manjari is still here. And of course, you will be given the handbook as well, which you can refer to if you need to at the end of this webinar.
I think you're on mute, Shivani.
Right, sorry. So I see there are no questions related specifically to Twitter, but if there are any in afterthought, like with any other session, please do send them in the chat or email them across, and we will try to have them answered. And we are going to be sort of closing a little bit early, but I'll request if Seemaji or Aarti have anything to add towards the end as we end the session.
अपने सभी साथियों से मैं बस इतना ही कहना चाहूंगी कि यहाँ पे आपको बहुत से पक्ष देखने को मिले, यहाँ पे बहुत सी जानकारियां देखने को मिली। आरती जी ने बताया कैसे कोल से रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी पे जाना अब भारत के लिए इनएविटेबल है। आज नहीं तो 10 साल बाद, चाहे धीरे जाए चाहे तेजी से जाए, मगर ये ट्रांजिशन जो है, ये बदलाव आएगा ही हमारे ऊर्जा के ढांचे में। जो ढांचा है परंपरागत कोयले पे आधारित या निर्भर, वो धीरे धीरे अब रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी की तरफ जाएगा, चाहे वो विंड एनर्जी हो, सोलर एनर्जी हो या बायोमास एनर्जी हो। और उसकी वजह भी बताएं कि कैसे ग्लोबल वार्मिंग की वजह से, और ग्लोबल वार्मिंग को 1.5 डिग्री तक रखने के लिए भारत ने भी अंत में ये फैसला कर लिया है कि वो 2070 तक नेट जीरो हो गई। इसी तरह संदीप पाई जी ने बताया कैसे कोयला आधारित जो राज्य हैं उनको अपनी इकोनॉमी को, अपनी आर्थिक अर्थव्यवस्था को और चीज़ों पे भी और निर्भर करना पड़ेगा, अपने को डाइवर्सिफाई करें ताकि वो अपनी जो अर्थव्यवस्था है उसको मजबूत आर्थिक ढांचे को कर सके, सिर्फ कोयले पर ही ना निर्भर रखें, ताकि जब ये बदलाव आए तो एकदम से ऐसा ना हो कि उनकी अर्थव्यवस्था चौपट हो जाए। श्रेष्ठा बनर्जी ने आप लोगों के सामने बताया, एक अनोखा पक्ष रखा कि कैसे कोयले के इस खेल में, इस पूरे उद्योग में जो दिहाड़ी मजदूर जिसे कहते हैं, कॉन्ट्रैक्ट वर्कर्स, वो कितने ज्यादा हैं और जिनका किसी को पता नहीं है। इसलिए उनके साथ न्याय की बात कैसे करें, पता नहीं उनको क्या कंपनसेशन मिलना है, क्योंकि उनको तो कभी उनका कोई नंबरिंग ही नहीं मौजूद है, ये पता ही नहीं है कि कितने हैं मौजूद। उनको जो नॉर्मल एक काम करने वाले रोजगार मजदूरों को होता है कि छुट्टी मिलती है या कोई बीमार हो जाने पे उनको स्वास्थ्य के लिए सहायता मिलती है, वो सब चीजें भी उनके लिए नहीं मैसर है। ऐसे में जब ट्रांजिशन होगा तो उनके लिए क्या चीजें होंगी, क्या जरूरतें होंगी उनकी और क्या होगा, कैसे इसको न्यायपूर्ण बनाएं, इस पक्ष पे भी एक महत्वपूर्ण उन्होंने बात बिंदु उठाई जिस पर गौर करने की हम सबको जरूरत है और करना चाहिए। स्वाति जी ने भी सोशल इकोनॉमिक इम्पैक्ट्स जो हैं कोयले के वो बताए और बताया कि ऐसे बहुत सारे उद्योग हैं जो कोयले पे निर्भर हैं, जैसे स्पॉन्ज आयरन, स्टील और बहुत सारी इंडस्ट्रीज, और जो ये इंडस्ट्रीज इन कोयला बहुल्य राज्यों में हैं, जैसे झारखंड, छत्तीसगढ़, जो भी कोयला उत्पादक राज्य है उनमें ये इंडस्ट्रीज जो हैं भरी पड़ी हैं। तो इन इंडस्ट्रीज पे भी प्रभाव पड़ेगा इस बदलाव का, और कैसे इसके लिए ये प्रिपेयर होने की जरूरत है इनको। इस तरह से राकेश जी ने बहुत अच्छा पक्ष रखा आप लोगों के सामने कि इसके लीगल एस्पेक्ट्स क्या हैं, कैसे किन कोयला आधारित थर्मल पावर प्लांट्स को पुराने हो चुके हैं, किस आधार पे, बॉयलर्स के आधार पे उनको बंद करना चाहिए, क्या है कानून, क्या जानकारियां जो हैं पब्लिक सेक्टर में मौजूद हैं, क्या नहीं है। इन जानकारियों को हासिल करने की तरफ भी सोचना एक बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट बिंदु है। साथ ही मयंक जी ने बहुत सी बातों को बताया कि क्या क्या मुद्दे ऐसे हैं जो इन सब से जोड़ते हैं। अभी पिछले दिनों बहुत सी स्टोरीज आई हैं झारखंड से, जैसे एयर पोल्यूशन पे आई, किसी ने स्टोरी शायद प्रभात खबर में एक खबर छपी थी कि कैसे कोयला माइनिंग की जगह पे, जो स्टेट जहाँ पे माइनिंग हो रही है, वहाँ एयर पोल्यूशन की वजह से एबॉर्शंस की संख्या बढ़ रही है, जो अपने आप में बहुत अच्छी जानकारी है। ऐसे ही एक स्टोरी और आई थी जो बता रही थी कि कोयले की बंद होती खदानों में कैसे मजदूर जो हैं वो अपना भविष्य ढूंढ रहे हैं, वो फिर से रोजगार के अवसर तलाश कर रहे हैं, और कोयले की खदानें जो बंद हो रही हैं, मेरे ख्याल से गिडरी की खदान की बात हो रही थी। इस तरह की बहुत सारी खबरें झारखंड से आ रही हैं, आप लोग बहुत अच्छे से लिख रहे हैं, और इस सफर में क्लाइमेट ट्रेंड्स जो है आपके साथ है और साथ ही रहेगा। और आज जितने भी प्रेजेंटेशंस हुए हैं उनको हम आपके साथ शेयर करने की कोशिश करेंगे। आपको जो भी जानकारियां चाहिए उनके लिए हम आपकी मदद करने की भरपूर कोशिश करेंगे, और उम्मीद है हम आपके साथ जुड़े रहेंगे। इन शब्दों के साथ मैं आप सबका धन्यवाद देती हूँ। मैं रिक्वेस्ट करती हूँ आरती जी से कि वो अपने कंक्लूडिंग रिमार्क्स दें। Thank you very much.
No, Seema ji, nothing to add actually. You've captured everything. I only want to say that, at the start of the holiday period, so to say, it's very encouraging to see a lot of us attending 3-4 hours of a workshop, which is an entire day. So I only want to thank everybody for that. And given the interest in the subject and the fact that क्लाइमेट के कॉन्वर्सेशंस, एनर्जी के ऊपर, कोल के ऊपर, ट्रांजिशन के ऊपर अगले 1 साल तक काफी इंपॉर्टेंट होने वाले हैं। जो अभी मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ पावर के पास ड्राफ्ट नेशनल इलेक्ट्रिसिटी पॉलिसी पड़ी है, वो 15 साल की पॉलिसी है, आज से लेके अगले 15 years, एंड जो भी अभी फॉर्मुलेट होगा विल सेट द स्टेज फॉर व्हाट द ट्रांजिशन विल बी अबाउट। एंड आई थिंक देयरफॉर व्हाट गेट्स रिटन इन द पॉलिसी इज एक्सट्रीमली इंपॉर्टेंट, not just from the point of view of coal, but also in general from the point of view of India's energy mix. So definitely हमारा भी उसमें interest है, और अभी we will take a little break for 10 days or so, but Seemaji, Shivani, Madhulika, I and the team will be in touch with you shortly in January to see what can we do. COVID variant permitting, is a physical meeting possible, or if not, then definitely we will keep avenues open to engage. I know that it was a long day and our speakers had to give their talk and leave, but I do want to thank each one of them for giving their time at short notice and being available for what was a wonderful presentation by everyone. So thanks everyone, and I see only Rakesh ji is here. Thanks Rakesh ji for the talk, and very happy to keep engaging with this group in future.
Thank you, Aarti.
And Mayank is there as well. Sorry. Thanks very much. You are in the journalist fraternity. You're not in the speaker fraternity, as you can see.
No, thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.